Harry Potter could have pretended to be sick. It would have been easy enough. A few strategic coughs, a hand pressed to his forehead, maybe even working up a proper fever if he concentrated hard enough on feeling miserable, which he already did most days, so that wouldn't have been difficult. But Dudley's birthday was sacred territory in the Dursley household, and missing it would have meant consequences that made a day trapped at the zoo seem like the lesser evil. He sat in his cupboard under the stairs, pulling on the least damaged of Uncle Vernon's old T-shirts, the fabric hanging loose around his small frame. Through the thin door, he could hear Petunia fussing over Dudley in the kitchen, her voice taking on that special sugary tone she reserved for her precious son. "Now, Dudders, you're sure you want to take Harry along to the zoo? It's your special day, after all." Harry paused in tying his oversized trainers. He'd assumed he'd be left with Mrs. Fig again, though something had happened with her recently. Something about breaking her leg. He hadn't been paying close attention when Petunia had mentioned it, too focused on not reacting visibly to whatever new inconvenience was being discussed above his head. "Piers is coming." Dudley's voice carried through the door, thick with the satisfied smugness that came with being the center of attention. "And his mum said she'd only drive if we take the freak along so there's someone to watch him while we have fun." The freak. Harry's jaw tightened as he finished with his shoes. 10 years of that name, among others, and it still hit like a small, sharp stone each time. He supposed he should be grateful. At least this way he'd get to see something other than the 4 walls of number 4, even if it meant spending the day being deliberately excluded from whatever entertainment Dudley and Piers devised for themselves. Petunia's heels clicked across the kitchen floor. "Well, I suppose it can't be helped. Harry!" Her voice took on its usual sharp edge when addressing him. "Get out here. And I don't want to hear a single word of complaint today. Do you understand? This is Dudley's day, and you'll do nothing to ruin it." Harry opened the cupboard door and stepped into the hallway, blinking in the brighter light. Petunia stood with her hands on her hips, her thin face set in its customary expression of irritation whenever she looked at him. She wore a floral dress that did nothing to soften her angular frame, and her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes. "Do you understand me?" she repeated, her pale eyes narrowing. "Yes, Aunt Petunia." Dudley burst into the hallway then, already dressed in his best clothes for the outing. At 11 years old, he was significantly larger than Harry despite being only months older, his face round and pleased with the world that revolved around him. His blonde hair was carefully combed, and he wore a new striped shirt that Petunia had bought specially for his birthday. "Where's my birthday hug?" Dudley demanded, throwing his arms around Petunia's waist. She melted immediately, her harsh expression transforming into something soft and doting. "Oh, my precious boy. 11 years old today. I can hardly believe it." Harry stood quietly to one side, watching this display of affection with the detached observation that had become his default mode during family interactions. He'd learned long ago that calling attention to himself during Dudley's special moments only led to punishment later. Better to become invisible, to let them forget he existed until they actively needed someone to blame for something. The doorbell rang, and Petunia straightened, smoothing her dress. "That'll be Piers and his mother. Now remember, best behavior from everyone." Her eyes lingered meaningfully on Harry. Piers Polkiss was a thin, rat-faced boy who served as Dudley's primary audience and occasional conscience-free accomplice. His mother was a tired-looking woman who barely glanced at Harry as she handed over responsibility for her son to Petunia. "We'll have them back by 6, Mrs. Polkiss said, already heading back toward her car. "And thank you again for taking Piers along. He's been so excited about the zoo." The drive to the zoo passed in predictable fashion. Dudley and Piers sat in the back seat, loudly discussing which animals they wanted to see and making increasingly elaborate plans for how they'd spend the rest of Dudley's birthday money. Harry sat pressed against the window, watching the countryside give way to London's outskirts, trying to summon some enthusiasm for what should have been an interesting day out. "Remember," Petunia said as they approached the zoo entrance, "we're here for Dudley's birthday. I don't want any strange business, Harry. No wandering off, no touching things you shouldn't, and absolutely no drawing attention to yourself." Strange business? Harry almost smiled at that. If only Aunt Petunia knew about the really strange business, the times when impossible things happened around him, things he couldn't explain and definitely couldn't control. Like last month, when he'd been running from Dudley's gang and somehow ended up on the school roof, with no memory of how he'd gotten there, or the time Petunia had tried to force him into one of Dudley's old sweaters, and it had somehow shrunk smaller and smaller until it wouldn't fit over his head. He pushed those thoughts away. Today was about getting through Dudley's birthday without incident. Nothing more. The zoo was crowded with families and school groups, the summer weather having drawn out what seemed like half of London. Petunia bought ice creams for Dudley and Piers, pointedly not offering one to Harry, and they set off toward the reptile house. "I want to see the biggest snake they have," Dudley announced, licking his ice cream with aggressive enthusiasm. "Piers says they have one that could swallow a whole person." "Don't be ridiculous, Dudley," Petunia said, but she was smiling. "Though I'm sure they have some very impressive specimens." The reptile house was dim and cool after the bright sunshine outside. Glass cases lined the walls, each containing a different species of snake, lizard, or other cold-blooded creature. Most of the snakes were lying motionless under heat lamps, looking more like expensive sculptures than living animals. Dudley and Piers pressed their faces against case after case, tapping on the glass and making hissing sounds, trying to provoke some kind of reaction. The snakes remained determinedly inert. "This is boring," Piers complained, after they'd made it halfway through the room without seeing so much as a flicker of movement. "They're all asleep." "Maybe they're dead," Dudley said hopefully. "Dead things are more interesting than sleeping things." Harry trailed behind them, hands stuffed in his pockets, actually finding himself more interested in the snakes than he'd expected to be. They looked peaceful, at least. No one was bothering them. Well, except for Dudley and Piers. But the glass kept them safe from that particular annoyance. They stopped in front of the largest case, which housed an enormous boa constrictor. The information placard read that it was from Brazil, and that boa constrictors were non-venomous snakes that killed their prey by constriction. This particular specimen was easily 12 feet long and as thick around as Harry's waist, its patterned skin gleaming dully in the artificial light. "Now this is more like it," Dudley breathed, pressing both hands against the glass. "Look at the size of that thing. I bet it could eat Piers in one gulp." "Could not," Piers protested, but he looked nervous. Dudley began drumming his fists against the glass. "Wake up! Do something! Move!" The snake didn't so much as twitch. Petunia had wandered over to read about the monitor lizards, leaving the boys to their entertainment. Harry found himself standing directly in front of the boa's case, studying the magnificent creature with genuine curiosity. It really was beautiful in its way, all that power coiled up and resting. "Boring," Dudley declared finally, giving the glass one last frustrated bang. "Come on, Piers. Let's go find something that's actually alive." They moved on to the next case, leaving Harry alone with the boa. He looked at it more closely, taking in the intricate patterns on its scales, the way its body curved in perfect loops. It must be frustrating, he thought, being stuck in a glass case all day, with people constantly banging on your walls and demanding entertainment. "I know how you feel," he said quietly, not really expecting anything to happen. The boa constrictor's eyes snapped open. Harry jerked back, startled. The snake was looking directly at him, its dark eyes alert and somehow almost intelligent. For a moment, they simply stared at each other through the glass. "You can understand me, can't you?" Harry whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The snake nodded. Actually nodded, a definite up-and-down motion of its triangular head. Harry's heart began beating faster. This was definitely strange business, stranger than anything that had happened to him before. But somehow, it didn't feel frightening. It felt right, almost. "Natural. Where are you from?" he asked. "Originally, I mean?" The snake turned its head toward the information placard, then back to Harry. When Harry looked at the sign, he understood. "Brazil? You've never been to Brazil, have you?" The snake shook its head, then turned toward the placard again. Harry read it more carefully this time. "Bred in captivity," he read aloud. "You've been here your whole life, haven't you?" That's horrible. I'm sorry." The boa seemed to shrug, as much as a snake could shrug. "Harry, what are you doing over there?" Petunia's sharp voice cut through the air like a whip. Harry spun around, his face flushing with guilt. "Nothing, Aunt Petunia. Just looking." She marched over, her expression thunderous. "I told you not to wander off. And what were you doing? Talking to yourself like a mad person?" "No, I was just nothing. You'll stay right here where I can see you, and you'll keep your mouth shut. Honestly, the embarrassment." Dudley and Piers had returned, drawn by the commotion. "What's Harry done now?" Dudley asked with interest. "Nothing," Petunia said firmly, "and he's going to keep it that way." But Dudley had noticed the boa, which was now definitely awake and moving around its enclosure. "Oh, wow. Look, Piers, it's moving. It wasn't doing that before." Both boys pressed against the glass again, watching in fascination as the snake moved with fluid grace around its small territory. Harry found himself watching too, mesmerized by the smooth power of its movement. "I wish I could talk to it," Piers said. "I bet it has amazing stories about eating people." "Boas don't eat people," Harry said automatically, then immediately regretted speaking. "How would you know?" Dudley sneered. "You don't know anything about snakes." That was true, as far as Harry knew. He had no idea where his certainty about the snake's diet had come from, any more than he could explain how he'd managed to communicate with it. But somehow, he did know. Just like he knew that the boa had been trying to tell him something important, something about being trapped and understanding what that felt like. Dudley gave the glass another bang, harder this time. "Do something impressive! It's my birthday!" The snake fixed Dudley with what could only be described as a withering look, then turned its attention back to Harry. Its dark eyes seemed to hold a question. "I wish I could help," Harry whispered, too quietly for the others to hear. "But I don't know how." The snake tilted its head slightly, as if considering this. Then, quite suddenly, it began moving toward the front of the case, where Dudley was still banging on the glass with increasing frustration. "That's more like it," Dudley crowed. "Look, Piers, it's coming over here." But the snake wasn't looking at Dudley. It was looking at Harry, and there was something almost like gratitude in its eyes. Then, without warning, the glass front of the case simply vanished. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The thick glass that had separated the snake from the public was simply gone, leaving nothing but air between the enormous boa and the suddenly very pale Dudley Dursley. Then several things happened at once. Piers screamed. Dudley tried to step backward and somehow managed to fall into the case, landing with a splash in the shallow pool at the back, where the glass had reappeared as mysteriously as it had disappeared. The boa constrictor slithered out of its enclosure with elegant dignity, pausing briefly in front of Harry. "Brazil, here I come. Thankses, amigo." The voice was unmistakably the snake's, a dry whisper that somehow Harry understood perfectly. Then the boa was moving past him, flowing across the floor of the reptile house with purpose and grace, heading for the exit. What followed was chaos. People began screaming and pointing. Parents grabbed their children and backed against the walls. A security guard came running, took one look at the 12-foot snake gliding serenely toward the door, and began shouting into his radio for backup. In the middle of it all, Dudley was thrashing around in the shallow water of the enclosure, yelling for help while Piers stood frozen in shock. Petunia had gone completely white and was making small, keening noises. What happened to the glass? Did anyone see? The zoo director arrived at a dead run, followed by several more staff members. He was a small, harried-looking man who kept wiping sweat from his forehead as he tried to assess the situation. "Nobody panic," he called out, though his own voice was pitched rather higher than normal. "We have protocols for this sort of thing. Has anyone been injured?" "My son!" Petunia found her voice at last. "My son is trapped in there." It took the combined efforts of 3 zoo employees to extract Dudley from the enclosure, and by that time, the boa constrictor had disappeared entirely. The staff were running around like headless chickens, trying to figure out where a 12-foot snake could possibly hide in a public zoo. Harry stood very still and quiet, trying to process what had just happened. He'd made the glass disappear. Somehow, impossible as it seemed, he'd made it vanish just by wanting to help the snake. And the snake had spoken to him. Actually spoken, in words he could understand. "I am so sorry," the zoo director was saying to Petunia, who had wrapped Dudley in her arms despite the fact that he was soaking wet and probably smelled like reptile habitat. "This is completely unprecedented. In 30 years of working with these animals, I've never seen anything like it. The glass must have had a structural weakness, some kind of flaw that finally gave way, though I have no idea how we missed it in our safety inspections." Petunia was nodding frantically, accepting his explanation because it was the only rational one available. But her eyes kept darting toward Harry with a look he recognized all too well. Suspicion. Fear. The kind of look she got when strange things happened around him. Things that couldn't be explained by structural weaknesses or coincidence. "We'll launch a full investigation immediately," the director continued. "And of course, we'll comp your admission today. This is simply unacceptable, and I assure you that it will never happen again." Other families were being ushered out of the reptile house while staff continued their search for the escaped boa. Harry caught fragments of excited conversation as people filed past. Everyone had a theory about what had happened, and several claimed to have seen exactly how the glass had disappeared, though none of their accounts matched. "I saw the whole thing," one man was saying importantly to his wife. "Stress fracture, clear as day. That glass just shattered all at once, turned to powder." "Nonsense," replied a woman nearby. "It was a small explosion of some sort. Probably a gas leak in the wall behind the case." "Don't be ridiculous. Glass doesn't just vanish into thin air. It had to go somewhere." But Harry knew better. The glass hadn't shattered or exploded or been damaged by a gas leak. It had simply stopped existing for a few crucial moments, long enough for one very large snake to slither to freedom. And somehow, impossibly, he had been the one to make it happen. As they finally left the reptile house, Dudley still dripping and complaining loudly about his ruined birthday, Harry caught sight of a group of people in expensive-looking robes standing near the zoo entrance. They seemed oddly out of place, talking in low, urgent voices and watching the building they'd just exited with intense interest. One of them, a severe-looking woman with iron-grey hair, caught Harry's eye for just a moment. She said something to her companions, and they all turned to look in his direction. Then Petunia grabbed his arm, hard enough to leave bruises, and hauled him toward the car park. "Don't you dare look back," she hissed under her breath. "Don't you dare!" But Harry had already seen enough to know that Dudley's birthday zoo trip had attracted exactly the kind of attention that Aunt Petunia spent her life trying to avoid. The kind of attention that meant his carefully ordinary life at number 4, Privet Drive, was about to become significantly more complicated. Petunia Dursley had spent the better part of 31 years perfecting the art of appearing perfectly normal. Normal hair, normal clothes, normal house, normal family. The kind of crushing, deliberate normalcy that smothered any hint of the abnormal before it could take root and spread like some kind of infection. Which was why the official-looking woman standing on her doorstep at 7:30 on a Saturday evening, holding what appeared to be some sort of credentials in a leather wallet, represented everything Petunia had spent a decade trying to avoid. "Mrs. Dursley!" The woman's voice was crisp and professional, with the sort of authority that suggested she was used to getting answers to her questions. She appeared to be in her 40s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp, dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her dark blue robes, not a coat or dress, which was already setting off every alarm bell in Petunia's head, were well cut and expensive-looking. "I'm Senior Inspector Williams from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. We need to discuss the incident at London Zoo this afternoon." Petunia's mouth went dry. She gripped the door frame so tightly her knuckles went white, fighting the urge to slam the door in the woman's face and pretend she'd never answered it. But that wouldn't work. These people, these magical people, they had ways of making you answer doors. She was sure of it. Ways of making you do all sorts of things you didn't want to do. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," she managed, though her voice came out higher and more strained than she'd intended. "We had a lovely day at the zoo. Nothing unusual happened at all." Inspector Williams consulted what looked like a small notebook, though Petunia could swear she hadn't had it in her hands a moment before. "According to our preliminary investigation, there was a significant magical incident at approximately 3:15 this afternoon in the reptile house. A 12-foot boa constrictor escaped its enclosure when the reinforced glass simply ceased to exist for several minutes. Multiple witnesses observed this phenomenon, though their memories have since been appropriately modified." The words hit Petunia like physical blows. Magical incident, modified memories, all the things she'd hoped to leave behind when she'd married Vernon and committed herself to a life of determined ordinariness. "I really don't think—" "Mrs. Dursley." Inspector Williams's voice was patient but firm. "We know that Harry Potter was present at the zoo today. We also know that he is currently living in your care. Given his unique circumstances, it's essential that we speak with you about what occurred." Petunia's hand moved to her throat, a nervous gesture she'd thought she'd trained herself out of years ago. Harry Potter. They knew about Harry. Of course they knew about Harry. The boy who lived, the boy who survived, the boy who had brought magic crashing back into her carefully constructed normal life like a wrecking ball through a picture window. "He's just a normal boy," she said weakly. "There's nothing unusual about him at all." Inspector Williams tilted her head slightly, studying Petunia with the sort of intense focus that made her want to squirm. "Mrs. Dursley, may I come in? This conversation would be better conducted privately." It wasn't really a question. Petunia stepped aside because she didn't see any alternative, and Inspector Williams walked into the hallway of number 4, Privet drive with the confidence of someone who was used to being admitted to places whether the inhabitants wanted her there or not. The house that Petunia had spent years perfecting, every surface polished, every ornament precisely positioned, every photograph carefully chosen to project an image of domestic bliss, suddenly felt small and shabby under the inspector's appraising gaze. Williams looked around the hallway with professional interest, taking in the family photos on the walls, the spotless surfaces, the expensive but tasteless furnishings that Vernon insisted projected success. "Where is Harry now?" Williams asked. "Upstairs, in his room. He's been very quiet since we got back from the zoo. Probably tired." Petunia was talking too fast, filling the silence with words because the alternative was letting this woman ask more questions. Questions that might have answers Petunia really didn't want to give. "I see. And would it be possible to speak with him?" "He's probably asleep," Petunia said quickly. "It's been a long day, and he's only 10. Children need their rest." Williams made a note in her little book. "Of course. Perhaps we could start with your account of what happened at the zoo, from the beginning." So Petunia found herself sitting in her own living room, clutching a cup of tea she didn't remember making, trying to explain the unexplainable to a woman who seemed to accept magic as casually as most people accepted the weather forecast. "It was Dudley's birthday," she began, sticking to the safest possible territory. "My son. He's 11 today. We thought a trip to the zoo would be a nice treat." "And Harry accompanied you?" "Yes." "Well, we couldn't really leave him behind, could we? Mrs. Figg, the woman who usually watches him when we go out, she's broken her leg. Fell over one of her cats." Petunia realized she was providing more information than the question had asked for, and forced herself to stop talking. "Mrs. Figg," Williams made another note. "Arabella Figg, of Wisteria Walk?" Petunia nodded, surprised that the inspector knew Mrs. Figg's full name and address. But then again, if these people knew about Harry, they probably knew about everyone who'd ever had contact with him. The thought made her feel sick. "Please, continue with your account of the zoo incident." Petunia described the day as best she could, carefully editing out anything that might sound unusual. Dudley and his friend Piers had been excited to see the snakes. They'd found the boa constrictor particularly impressive. There had been some sort of structural failure with the glass, a terrible accident that could have happened to anyone. The snake had escaped, but fortunately no one had been hurt. "And where was Harry during this incident?" Williams asked, standing nearby, watching the snakes like the other children. "Did he say anything? Do anything unusual?" Petunia hesitated just a moment too long. "No, nothing unusual." Williams studied her face with uncomfortable intensity. "Mrs. Dursley, I should explain that we have ways of verifying the accuracy of witness accounts, magical ways. It would be much easier for everyone involved if you were completely honest with me from the beginning." The threat was politely worded, but it was definitely a threat. Petunia set down her teacup with hands that weren't quite steady. "I don't know what you want me to say. It was an accident, a terrible accident, but an accident nonetheless." "Indeed." Williams flipped through several pages of her notebook. "Mrs. Dursley, how long has Harry been living with you?" "Since he was a baby. Since his parents—" Petunia couldn't finish the sentence. Even after 10 years, she couldn't bring herself to say the words out loud. Since his parents were murdered by a dark wizard. Since the magical world that Lily had chosen over her family had finally claimed her life. Since November 1981, Williams supplied. "And in that time, has Harry displayed any unusual abilities?" "No." The word came out flat and final. "Nothing unusual at all." Williams made a note that seemed to go on for much longer than Petunia's simple denial should have warranted. I see. And Harry's living arrangements here. He has his own room, I assume. Of course he has his own room, Petunia snapped, stung by the implication that she wouldn't provide basic necessities for a child in her care. What sort of people do you think we are? I'm sure it's lovely. Would it be possible to see it? The question hit Petunia like a physical blow. Harry's room, the cupboard under the stairs, with its single bare bulb and collection of broken toys and outgrown clothes. The space that had seemed like a perfectly reasonable solution to the problem of housing an unwanted child, but which suddenly felt like the most damning evidence possible when viewed through the eyes of someone who might actually care about Harry's welfare. He's sleeping, she repeated desperately. I really don't want to disturb him. Williams closed her notebook with a soft snap. Mrs. Dursley, I'm going to be frank with you. We have significant concerns about what happened at the zoo today. This was not a random magical accident. It was a focused, intentional use of magic by an untrained child who is supposed to be living in a safe, stable environment that helps him manage his abilities until he's old enough for proper instruction. Petunia felt the blood drain from her face. His abilities? Harry is a wizard, Mrs. Dursley, a very powerful one from all indications. Surely you knew this. Of course she'd known. She'd known from the moment Dumbledore had left Harry on her doorstep with that terrible letter explaining things she hadn't wanted to understand. But knowing it and admitting it out loud were two very different things. I was hoping he'd grow out of it, she whispered. Williams's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained professional. Magic doesn't work that way, I'm afraid. It's not something a child can grow out of or suppress indefinitely. Attempting to do so often leads to exactly the sort of uncontrolled incidents we witnessed today. What does that mean? It means that Harry needs proper guidance and training to learn to control his abilities. It also means that his current living situation may not be adequate for his needs. The words hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. Petunia had spent 10 years dreading this moment, the moment when Harry's freakishness would bring the magical world crashing back into her life, destroying everything she'd built. "May I see Harry's room now?" Williams asked again, and this time it definitely wasn't a request. They climbed the stairs together, Petunia's legs feeling like lead with every step. Past the master bedroom she shared with Vernon, past Dudley's room with its countless toys and electronics, past the guest room that was never used, to the narrow hallway that led to the kitchen stairs. "His room is downstairs," Petunia said quietly. Williams raised an eyebrow but said nothing, following Petunia back down to the ground floor and through the kitchen to the cupboard under the stairs. Petunia opened the door with trembling fingers, revealing the small, dark space that had been Harry's world for nearly 10 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Inspector Williams stepped closer, studying the tiny space with its single bulb, the narrow cot with its thin blanket, the collection of broken toys and outgrown clothes that constituted Harry's possessions. She ran her fingers along the inside of the door, where Harry had scratched tallies to mark the passing days during his longer punishments. "How long has Harry been sleeping here?" she asked finally. "Since he came to us." Petunia's voice was barely above a whisper. It seemed practical. "The bedrooms upstairs are for family." Williams turned to look at her, and Petunia saw something cold and terrible in the inspector's dark eyes. "Mrs. Dursley, this is not a bedroom. This is a closet, a storage cupboard barely large enough for a grown man to stand upright in, let alone for a child to live in." "He's never complained," Petunia said desperately. He's always been very quiet, very well behaved. No trouble at all. A 10-year-old child living in a cupboard doesn't complain because he doesn't understand that he deserves better, Williams said, her professional composure finally cracking slightly. Mrs. Dursley, do you understand what you've just shown me? Petunia shook her head, though she was beginning to suspect she knew exactly what she'd shown the inspector. You've shown me evidence of systematic neglect and emotional abuse of a child in your care. A child who was placed with you specifically because it was believed you would provide him with a loving, stable home environment. The words hit Petunia like physical blows. Abuse. The word she'd never allowed herself to think, let alone speak aloud. Harry wasn't abused. He was disciplined, kept in line, prevented from becoming something unnatural and frightening. But looking at the cupboard through Inspector Williams's eyes, she saw it for what it really was. A prison for a child whose only crime was being born into a world that had already taken everything from him. I need to speak with my colleagues, Williams said, producing what looked like a small mirror from her robes. Mrs. Dursley, I strongly advise you not to leave the house this evening. We will be conducting a thorough investigation into Harry's living situation, and there may be additional questions. She moved away, speaking quietly into the mirror in words that Petunia couldn't quite catch. But she heard enough to understand that Inspector Williams was requesting immediate backup, and that the words Muggle liaisons were mentioned several times. Petunia sank into one of her kitchen chairs, staring at the open cupboard door and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. This morning, she'd had a normal life with normal problems. Now she was facing the collapse of everything she'd built, all because Harry Potter couldn't keep his freakishness under control for one single day. When Inspector Williams returned, her expression was grimmer than before. Mrs. Dursley, given the unique circumstances of this case, Harry's status in the wizarding world, his placement with non-magical relatives, and the evident failure of that placement to provide adequate care, this matter is being transferred to our Muggle Liaisons office. What does that mean? It means that specialists who are trained to work with non-magical individuals in situations involving magical children will be taking over this case. They have the authority to work with appropriate Muggle agencies to ensure Harry's welfare. Muggle agencies. Petunia felt the last of her hopes crumble. Social services, she whispered. Among others, yes. Mrs. Dursley, I want you to understand the seriousness of what's happening here. Harry Potter is not just any magical child. He's rather famous in our world. The circumstances of his placement with you were highly irregular, arranged by someone with significant influence who believed it was in Harry's best interests. If it becomes known that this arrangement has resulted in his mistreatment— She didn't need to finish the sentence. Petunia understood perfectly. The magical world that had taken her sister away, the world she'd spent years trying to forget existed, was about to descend on little Whinging with all the force of a hurricane. What happens now? She asked. Now we wait for the liaisons team to arrive. They'll want to speak with Harry to assess his physical and emotional condition. They'll also want to conduct a more thorough investigation of his living situation and treatment while in your care. Petunia nodded numbly. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to hide. The careful facade of normalcy she'd maintained for 10 years was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of multiple cars pulling up outside number 4, Privet Drive. Official cars, she was certain, filled with official people who were about to turn her perfectly ordinary life completely upside down. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly. Harry was awake, probably listening to the voices downstairs and trying to understand what was happening. In a few minutes, strangers would be asking him questions about his life, his treatment, his tiny room under the stairs. And Petunia knew, with cold certainty, that everything he told them would be the truth. Harry had been sitting on the top step of the stairs for nearly an hour, listening to the low murmur of voices from the kitchen below. At first, there had been just Aunt Petunia and the woman in the dark blue robes, but now there were more voices, at least 3 different people, maybe 4. Their words were too quiet to make out clearly, but the tone was serious, official, and somehow different from any conversation he'd ever heard in this house. Different because none of the voices sounded angry. Different because no one was shouting about freakishness or ungrateful children or the burden of taking care of someone who didn't deserve it. Different because, for the first time in his memory, adults were discussing him without the underlying current of resentment that usually colored such conversations. His thin pajamas weren't much protection against the chill that seemed to seep up through the floorboards, but Harry didn't dare go back to his cupboard. Not when there were strangers in the house who might be there because of what had happened at the zoo. Not when Aunt Petunia's voice had that particular tight quality that meant she was frightened, which usually meant very bad things for him once the visitors left. The kitchen door opened, and footsteps moved into the hallway. Harry peered through the banister rails and saw Inspector Williams walking toward the front door with a woman he didn't recognize. The stranger was younger than Williams, probably in her 30s, with brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and clothes that looked distinctly non-magical. A dark jacket, sensible shoes, and a briefcase that looked completely ordinary. She moved with quiet confidence, the way adults did when they were comfortable with their authority, but not interested in using it to intimidate anyone. "Thank you for the briefing," the stranger was saying to Williams. "I'll take it from here. You'll have my preliminary assessment by Monday morning." "Of course. And remember, this case has particular sensitivities. The boy's background, his eventual placement in the wizarding world, all of that needs to be taken into consideration." "I understand. But first, we need to ensure his immediate safety and well-being. Everything else is secondary to that." Williams nodded and let herself out the front door. The stranger, the social worker, Harry realized with a mixture of hope and terror, stood in the hallway for a moment, looking around with the same professional assessment he'd seen Williams use. Then she looked up and saw him sitting on the stairs. "Hello," she said, her voice gentle but not falsely sweet. "You must be Harry. I'm Miss Chen. I work for the Social Services Department, and I'm here to have a chat with you about how things are going at home. Would that be all right?" Harry nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. A chat about how things are going at home. He'd never had one of those before. Adults usually told him how things were going to be, not asked him how he felt about how they were. Aunt Petunia appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale and strained. "I'm sure Harry doesn't have anything to say that would be of interest to you. He's a very quiet child. Never causes any trouble." Miss Chen turned toward Petunia with polite attention, but Harry could see something sharp and measuring in her expression. "Mrs. Dursley, I'd like to speak with Harry privately first, if that's all right. It's standard procedure in these situations to give children the opportunity to speak freely without family members present." "These situations?" Petunia's voice went up half an octave. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. This is a perfectly normal household with perfectly normal—" "Mrs. Dursley." Miss Chen's voice remained calm, but there was something steely underneath it. "I've already been briefed on the circumstances that brought me here, including the discovery of Harry's living accommodations. I understand this is a difficult situation for your family, but my primary concern is Harry's welfare. I'm sure you want what's best for him as well." The way she said living accommodations made it sound clinical and wrong, which Harry supposed it was. He'd never really thought about his cupboard as wrong before. It was just where he lived, where he'd always lived. But the way the adults had been talking about it, the way Miss Chen's jaw had tightened when she mentioned it, suggested that maybe other children didn't live in cupboards under the stairs. "Harry," Miss Chen said, looking back up at him, "would you like to come down and sit with me in the living room? We can have our chat there." Harry climbed slowly down the stairs, acutely aware of how his too large pajamas made him look even smaller and more pathetic than usual. Aunt Petunia watched him with sharp, warning eyes. But she didn't say anything as Miss Chen guided him into the living room and settled into one of the good chairs that were usually reserved for important guests. Miss Chen opened her briefcase and took out a notepad and pen, but she didn't start writing immediately. Instead, she studied Harry with careful attention, taking in his thin frame, his too large clothes, the way he perched on the edge of the sofa, as if he expected to be told to leave at any moment. "Harry, I want you to know that you're not in any trouble," she said finally. Sometimes when social workers come to visit, children think they've done something wrong. But you haven't. I'm here because some people are concerned about you, and they want to make sure you're safe and being properly cared for. The concept was so foreign that Harry had trouble processing it. People were concerned about him. Adults who weren't required by law to house him actually cared whether he was safe. "Do you understand what I mean?" Miss Chen asked gently. Harry nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he did. "Good. Now, I'd like to ask you some questions about your life here with your aunt and uncle and cousin. Some of them might seem obvious, but it's important that I hear the answers from you. Is that all right?" Another nod. "Let's start with something simple. How old are you, Harry?" 10, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first word he'd spoken to her, and it came out hoarse from disuse. "And when is your birthday?" "July 31st. The date was burned into his memory, not because it was ever celebrated, but because it was the day each year when Dudley got extra presents to make up for having to share his birthday month with Harry. Miss Chen made a note. "And you've been living here with the Dursleys since you were a baby?" "Yes." "Do you remember your parents at all?" Harry shook his head. This was familiar territory. He'd learned long ago not to ask questions about his parents. According to Aunt Petunia, they'd been killed in a car crash, and asking for details only led to sharp words about being ungrateful and not bothering people with questions about things that didn't matter anymore. "Harry, I'd like to ask you about your room. Can you tell me about it?" The question made his stomach clench with anxiety. His cupboard wasn't something he'd ever had to explain to anyone before. It was just where he lived. But the way Miss Chen asked about it, the careful neutrality in her voice, suggested she already knew the answer and was testing whether he'd tell her the truth. "It's under the stairs," he said finally. Miss Chen's pen paused over her notepad. "Under the stairs?" "Yes, it's small, but it's mine." He wasn't sure why he felt the need to defend it, except that it was the only space in the house that belonged to him, even if it had started life as a storage cupboard. "How long have you had this room?" "Always. Since I came here." Miss Chen made several notes, her handwriting quick and precise. "Can you describe it for me? What's it like inside?" Harry tried to find words for the space that had defined his entire existence. "It's got a light bulb and a cot, and my clothes and things. There's spiders sometimes, but they don't bother me." "Is there a window?" "No." "And how big is it? Could you stand up all the way inside it?" Harry considered this. "I can now. But I couldn't when I was smaller." The implication of what he'd just said seemed to hit Miss Chen like a physical blow. She stared at him for a long moment, her professional composure slipping slightly. "Harry, has anyone ever told you that most children have proper bedrooms? With windows and space to keep their toys and clothes?" He shook his head. The concept of a proper bedroom was as foreign to him as the idea of flying to the moon. He'd seen Dudley's room, of course, but that was different. Dudley was family. Dudley belonged. Miss Chen asked him about meals next, and Harry tried to explain the complicated system of mealtimes at number 4. Sometimes he ate with the family, usually leftovers or whatever Aunt Petunia decided he could have. Sometimes he ate alone in the kitchen after everyone else was finished. Sometimes, when he'd done something wrong, or when Dudley needed punishing but couldn't be punished directly, he didn't eat at all. "When you say sometimes you don't eat at all," Miss Chen said carefully, "do you mean you skip one meal, or sometimes a day, sometimes longer?" Harry said it matter-of-factly, the way he might describe the weather. It had never occurred to him that this might be unusual. Miss Chen's pen had stopped moving entirely. "Harry, when was the last time you saw a doctor or a dentist?" Harry thought about this. "I don't think I ever have. Never. No. Aunt Petunia says I'm healthy enough, and doctors cost money." The conversation continued for what felt like hours, though Harry supposed it was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. Miss Chen asked about school, about friends, about what he did for fun, about whether anyone had ever hit him or hurt him on purpose. The questions were gentle but thorough, and Harry found himself answering more honestly than he'd ever answered anyone about anything. It was strange having an adult listen to him. Really listen. Not just wait for him to stop talking so they could tell him what he'd done wrong or what he needed to do differently. Miss Chen nodded at his answers, asked follow-up questions, and wrote everything down as if his words mattered. Finally, she closed her notepad and looked at him directly. "Harry, I want you to know that you've been very helpful today. You've answered all my questions honestly, and that takes courage." Courage? Harry had never thought of telling the truth as particularly courageous. But then again, he'd never been in a situation where the truth might actually help him instead of getting him into trouble. "What happens now?" he asked. Miss Chen smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he'd seen from her. "Now I have to write a report about what I've learned here today. And I have to work with my colleagues to figure out the best way to make sure you're safe and properly cared for." "Am I going to be in trouble?" "No, Harry, you're not going to be in trouble. But some things are going to have to change. The way you've been living here isn't acceptable, and it's not your fault." Harry nodded, though he wasn't sure he really understood what she meant. Change was usually bad in his experience. Change meant Dudley getting bigger and stronger and meaner. Change meant new rules and new ways to accidentally do things wrong. But the way Miss Chen said it, change sounded like it might be something positive. Miss Chen spent another 20 minutes with Aunt Petunia, and Harry could hear their voices through the living room door. Petunia's high and defensive, Miss Chen's calm but implacable. He caught fragments of phrases: immediate safety concerns, and alternative placement, and extended family members. Extended family members. Harry wondered who that might refer to. As far as he knew, the Dursleys were his only family. Aunt Petunia was his mother's sister, and she'd always made it clear that taking him in had been a tremendous sacrifice that he could never adequately repay. But maybe there were other people. Maybe there were relatives he'd never heard of. People who might want him. People who might actually be glad to have him around. It was a dangerous thought, and Harry tried not to let himself believe it too much. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment led to the cupboard, and no meals, and the special kind of silence that meant you'd forgotten your place in the world. But as Miss Chen gathered her things and prepared to leave, she stopped in the living room doorway and looked back at him. "Harry," she said, "I want you to remember what I said about you not being in trouble. Whatever happens next, it's not because you did anything wrong. It's because you deserve better than this. Every child deserves better than this." After she left, the house felt different somehow. Quieter, but not in the usual oppressive way. It was the kind of quiet that came before important changes, the kind that suggested the careful balance of life at number 4. Privet Drive was about to shift in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Harry went back to his cupboard and lay down on his narrow cot, staring up at the single light bulb and thinking about proper bedrooms and extended family members, and the radical idea that he might deserve something better than what he'd always known. Outside, he could hear Aunt Petunia on the telephone, her voice tight with barely controlled panic as she spoke to someone about the day's events. He couldn't make out most of the words, but he heard his name mentioned several times, along with phrases like social services and completely unreasonable and what are we supposed to do now? For the first time in his life, Harry found himself genuinely curious about the answer to that question. Andromeda Tonks was elbow-deep in preparing Sunday roast when the official owl arrived, tapping politely at the kitchen window with the kind of persistence that suggested it carried correspondence that couldn't be ignored. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the window, accepting the heavy parchment envelope with the ministry seal that immediately made her stomach tighten with old, familiar anxiety. 22 years of marriage to a Muggle-born wizard had taught her to expect the worst when official correspondence arrived unexpectedly. Anti-Muggle-born sentiment might be less virulent than it had been during the war years, but it never entirely disappeared, and Ted's work with the ministry's Muggle liaison office meant he occasionally found himself caught in the crossfire of political tensions he'd done nothing to create. Ted looked up from the Sunday Prophet as she returned to the kitchen, noting her expression. Ministry business on a Sunday? That's either very good news or very bad news, and your face suggests it's not the former. It's addressed to both of us, Andromeda said, turning the envelope over in her hands. The script was formal, official, and completely unfamiliar. Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, Muggle Liaison Office. Ted set down his newspaper, giving her his full attention. After 2 decades of marriage, they'd developed the kind of wordless communication that came from weathering enough crises together to recognize the signs of a new one approaching. "Well," he said finally, "we're not going to find out what it says by staring at it." Andromeda broke the seal and unfolded the parchment, scanning the contents quickly before reading it again, more slowly, her frown deepening with each line. "Andromeda?" Ted's voice held the careful neutrality he used when he was trying not to pressure her into sharing something she wasn't ready to discuss. "What is it?" "They want to meet with us. Tomorrow morning. It's about—" She paused, trying to make sense of what she was reading. "It's about Harry Potter." The name hung in the air between them, like a stone dropped into still water. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child who had defeated the Dark Lord and disappeared into the Muggle world. The boy who, according to this letter, was Andromeda's cousin, Sirius's godson, and her own second cousin, once removed through the tangled branches of the Black family tree. "Harry Potter," Ted repeated slowly. "The Harry Potter? What could the ministry possibly want with us about Harry Potter?" Andromeda read the relevant passage aloud. Following a recent incident requiring ministry intervention, we are conducting a review of potential placement options for Mr. Potter, who is currently in the care of his maternal relatives. Our records indicate that you are among his closest available magical relatives through your birth family connections. We would be grateful for the opportunity to discuss this matter with you at your earliest convenience. Ted was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Placement options, he said finally. That doesn't sound like a routine inquiry. No, Andromeda agreed, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. It sounds like something's gone very wrong. The letter included a time and address for the meeting. Not the ministry building, but a smaller office in Diagon Alley that Andromeda recognized as one of the secure meeting spaces used for sensitive family matters, the kind of place where difficult conversations happened away from the public eye and the bureaucratic machinery of the main ministry complex. What do we know about the boy's situation? Ted asked. I mean, beyond the obvious. Where has he been living all these years? Andromeda tried to recall what little she knew about Harry Potter's post-war placement. With Lily Potter's sister, I believe, Petunia something, a Muggle family. She paused, considering the implications of that. Ted, if they're looking at magical relatives for placement options, then something's gone wrong with the Muggle family, he finished. Something serious enough to warrant removing him from their care. They spent the rest of the evening in subdued discussion, trying to piece together what they could remember about Harry Potter's history and their own family's connection to him. Andromeda had been disowned from the Black family long before Sirius had been named as the boy's godfather, so most of her information was second-hand, gleaned from occasional conversations with colleagues who moved in circles closer to the political center of the wizarding world. What she did know painted a picture of a child who had been deliberately kept out of the public eye, raised away from the magical world that saw him as a living symbol of victory over dark forces. It had seemed reasonable at the time. The boy deserved a normal childhood, free from the expectations and pressures that would inevitably come with his fame. But if that arrangement was failing badly enough to require ministry intervention... We'll go to the meeting, she said finally as they prepared for bed, even if it's just to get more information. If there's a child in trouble, and we might be able to help. Ted nodded, understanding perfectly. 22 years of marriage had taught him to recognize the particular set of Andromeda's shoulders that meant she'd identified a problem that needed solving, and that she was already mentally preparing to solve it, whether or not it was technically her responsibility. The next morning found them in a small, comfortable office, decorated with the kind of carefully neutral furnishings that were meant to put visitors at ease during difficult conversations. The witch who greeted them was middle-aged, professionally dressed, and carried herself with the quiet competence of someone who spent her working life handling delicate family situations. Mr. and Mrs. Tonks, thank you for coming. I'm Senior Liaison Sarah Mitchell. Please have a seat. They settled into the offered chairs, and Mitchell opened a thick file folder that Andromeda couldn't help but notice was marked with Harry Potter's name. I'll get straight to the point, Mitchell said. On Saturday we had a significant magical incident involving Harry Potter that required ministry intervention. During the course of that intervention, we discovered that the boy's living situation with his maternal relatives has been inadequate. The word inadequate was delivered with the kind of careful understatement that suggested the reality was far worse than the euphemism implied. Inadequate how? Andromeda asked. Mitchell consulted her notes. The child has been living in a cupboard under the stairs for nearly 10 years. He has been subject to systematic neglect, emotional abuse, and deliberate isolation from any contact with the magical world. He has never received medical or dental care. His nutrition has been irregular at best. and his guardians appear to have been actively hostile to his magical nature, attempting to suppress it rather than help him manage it. The words hit Andromeda like physical blows. She felt Ted's hand find hers, squeezing gently as she tried to process what she was hearing. "A cupboard," she repeated numbly. "Under the stairs." "I'm afraid so." The Muggle social worker who assessed the situation described it as one of the most clear-cut cases of child neglect she'd encountered in 15 years of professional practice. Andromeda's mind was reeling. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child the entire wizarding world owed a debt of gratitude, had been living in a cupboard, had been abused and neglected and treated as an unwanted burden by the very people who were supposed to care for him. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did this happen? Didn't anyone check on him? Didn't anyone care enough to make sure he was all right?" Mitchell's expression remained carefully neutral, but Andromeda caught a flicker of something that might have been shared outrage. "The placement was arranged directly by Chief Warlock Dumbledore in November 1981, under emergency circumstances following the deaths of James and Lily Potter. Our understanding is that he believed the boy would be safest and happiest with his mother's family, away from the attention and pressures of the wizarding world. And no one followed up? No one checked to make sure that assumption was correct? No official follow-up was mandated. The placement was considered permanent and satisfactory. The clinical language couldn't disguise the magnitude of the failure. An entire government, an entire magical community had simply assumed that the child who had saved them all was being properly cared for, and no one had bothered to verify that assumption. "What happens now?" Ted asked. His voice was carefully controlled, but Andromeda could see the anger in the set of his jaw. "Now we need to find Harry proper placement, with people who can provide him with the care and support he needs. Given his unique circumstances, we believe it would be best for him to be placed with magical relatives who understand both his background and his eventual place in the wizarding world." "And you think we might be suitable?" Andromeda asked. Mitchell opened another file. "Our genealogical review indicates that you are Harry's closest available magical relative. Through your birth family, the Blacks, you are second cousins once removed. Your cousin Sirius was named as Harry's godfather, though his current incarceration obviously precludes him from fulfilling that role." Sirius. Andromeda's heart clenched at the mention of her favorite cousin, the one member of her birth family she'd genuinely mourned losing when she'd been disowned for marrying Ted. She'd known about his imprisonment, of course. It had been impossible to avoid the news when Sirius Black's arrest had been front-page news for months. But the idea that he'd been named as Harry's godfather, that he'd been meant to care for the boy before his life went so catastrophically wrong. "We've reviewed your records," Mitchell continued. "You have no criminal history, a stable marriage, a secure home, and experience raising a magical child. Your husband's work with our Muggle liaison office gives him particular insight into the challenges faced by Muggle-raised magical children. And your own background means you understand the political and social complexities that will eventually surround Harry as he takes his place in the wizarding world." "What would be involved?" Ted asked. "If we were to consider this." "Full legal custody, with appropriate financial support from Harry's inheritance to cover his care and education. You would have complete parental authority, including decisions about his magical education, medical care, and eventual career choices. In exchange, you would commit to providing him with a stable, loving home environment and appropriate preparation for his role in the magical community." A stable, loving home environment. The phrase seemed almost absurdly inadequate, given what the boy had already endured, But it was also exactly what Andromeda and Ted had spent 22 years building together. Their house was full of warmth and laughter, good food and gentle teasing, the kind of domestic happiness that came from two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company and had worked hard to create a life worth living. "Could we meet him?" Andromeda asked. "Before making any decisions, I mean. I'd like to see him for myself, talk to him, get a sense of what he needs." "Of course. Though I should warn you, he's been through a significant trauma in the last few days. The discovery that his entire living situation was considered unacceptable by the adults responsible for his welfare has been difficult for him to process." Andromeda thought about her own daughter, 18 years old and confident in her place in the world, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and valued and supported no matter what choices she made. The contrast with a 10-year-old boy who had apparently never experienced any of those things was almost too painful to contemplate. "When could we meet him?" she asked. "We could arrange something for this afternoon, if you're available. He's currently staying in temporary foster care while we finalize placement arrangements, but he's been told that we're looking for family members who might want to care for him permanently." Family members who might want him. The phrase caught in Andromeda's throat. How was it possible that a child, any child, but especially this child, had reached the age of 10 without ever knowing for certain that someone in the world wanted him? "Yes," she said firmly. "This afternoon would be fine. We'd very much like to meet Harry." As they left the office, Andromeda found herself thinking about second chances, about the strange ways that life sometimes circled back to offer opportunities to correct past mistakes. She'd lost her birth family when she'd chosen love over blood purity. But perhaps now she could gain a son, could offer a child the kind of family that every person deserved to have. The boy who had saved the wizarding world deserved, at the very least, to know what it felt like to be wanted. The Wizengamot offices in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement had the kind of imposing dignity that was designed to remind visitors that they were entering a place where serious decisions were made about serious matters. Ancient stone walls, heavy wooden furniture, and portraits of distinguished legal minds from centuries past created an atmosphere of weighty tradition that made even simple conversations feel momentous. Andromeda sat across from Councillor Marcus Graves, a thin, scholarly man in his 60s, whose expertise in magical family law had made him the ministry's go-to advisor for complex custody cases involving ancient bloodline magic. Ted sat beside her, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad, though most of what they were discussing was so far outside normal Muggle legal frameworks that his professional experience could only help so much. The fundamental challenge, Graves was saying, consulting a thick, leather-bound volume that looked older than the ministry building itself, is that Mr. Potter's current placement isn't simply a matter of convenience or even welfare. It's magically binding in ways that make any change extraordinarily complex. Senior Liaison. Mitchell, who had arranged this meeting, leaned forward in her chair. "Could you explain the blood protection in more detail? Mrs. Tonks needs to understand exactly what she'd be taking on if she proceeds with a custody petition." Graves turned several pages in his book, stopping at a section marked with numerous coloured bookmarks and marginalia. The magic in question was created by Lily Potter's sacrificial death, a very specific and very powerful form of protection that requires certain conditions to remain active. When Petunia Dursley accepted Harry into her home, she sealed that protection, creating a magical ward that keeps him safe from the same dark magic that killed his parents. "But the protection has requirements," Andromeda said. It wasn't a question. She'd spent enough time around ancient magical families to recognize the pattern of binding magic that came with conditions and constraints. Exactly. Harry must be able to call the place where his mother's blood dwells his home. As long as that condition is met, the protection remains active. But if he's permanently removed from Petunia Dursley's care— Graves spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. Well, there's no precedent for what happens to the protection. It could fade gradually, or it could collapse all at once. The implications hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Remove Harry from an abusive situation and potentially expose him to the kind of dark magic that had killed his parents. Leave him where he was and condemn him to years more of systematic neglect and emotional cruelty. Surely there's some alternative, Ted said. Some way to transfer the protection along with custody. Graves consulted his notes. There are theoretical possibilities. Blood adoption, for instance, might allow Mrs. Tonks to take on the same magical relationship to Harry that his aunt currently holds. But the magic involved is extraordinarily complex, requires the consent of all parties, and has never been attempted in a case involving sacrificial protection. What would blood adoption involve? Andromeda asked. A permanent magical bonding that would make you Harry's mother in every way that matters magically. It would give him your bloodline protections, your family magic, your inherited wards and shields. But it would also sever any remaining connection to his birth parents' magical legacy, including the protection his mother's sacrifice created. The trade-off was stark. Give Harry a new magical family and lose the protection that had kept him alive for 10 years, or find some other solution that might preserve both. Are there other options? Andromeda asked. Mitchell opened her own file folder. We've been researching alternatives. One possibility is partial custody, allowing Harry to maintain legal residence with the Dursleys while spending most of his time in your care. The blood protection would remain intact as long as he returned to Privet Drive periodically and continued to consider it home. You mean send him back to those people regularly? Ted's voice was carefully controlled, but Andromeda could hear the anger underneath. After what they've done to him? Not unsupervised, Mitchell said quickly. And not overnight, but perhaps holiday visits, or even just a few hours once a month. Enough to maintain the magical connection without subjecting him to ongoing abuse. Graves made a note in the margin of his book. That might work, legally speaking. The Wizengamot has approved similar arrangements in cases involving magical guardianship of Muggle-raised children. But it would require the Dursleys' cooperation, and given the circumstances that brought this case to our attention. They might not be willing to cooperate, Andromeda finished, particularly if they understood that their cooperation was the only thing standing between them and formal charges of child abuse. There's another complication, Graves continued. Mr. Potter's godfather, Sirius Black, was named as his legal guardian in James Potter's will. Even though he's currently incarcerated, any formal custody arrangement would need to address his prior claim. The mention of Sirius sent a sharp pang through Andromeda's chest. Her favorite cousin, the one person from her birth family she'd genuinely loved and lost when she'd been disowned, was sitting in Azkaban for crimes she still couldn't bring herself to believe he'd actually committed. The idea that his imprisonment was preventing him from caring for Harry added another layer of tragedy to an already complicated situation. What would that involve? She asked. Either Sirius would need to formally relinquish his claim, or the Wizengamot would need to declare him unfit to serve as guardian due to his incarceration. The latter is more straightforward legally, but it requires a formal hearing where his representatives could contest the decision. And how long would all of this take? Ted asked. Graves consulted a calendar marked with various court dates and deadlines. If we file the initial petition this week, we could have a preliminary hearing within a month. A full custody hearing would probably take another 6 to 8 weeks after that, assuming no major complications. 2 months. Harry would spend another 2 months in temporary foster care, while lawyers and magistrates debated the fine points of ancient blood magic and modern family law. It felt like an eternity when weighed against what the boy had already endured. "What happens to Harry during all of this?" Andromeda asked. Mitchell answered. "He remains in temporary foster care, with supervised visits from potential guardians. We could arrange regular contact, so he gets to know you, and you get to know him. But no formal placement can occur until the legal issues are resolved. And if the Wizengamot decides against us, if they determine that maintaining the blood protection is more important than removing him from the Dursleys." Graves looked uncomfortable. "Then we'd have to explore alternative remedies. Enhanced monitoring of his care, perhaps. Mandatory counseling for the family. Regular welfare checks." In other words, they'd send him back to the cupboard under the stairs and hope that official oversight would be enough to prevent further abuse. The thought made Andromeda feel sick. "There has to be a better solution," she said firmly. "Some way to protect both Harry's physical welfare and his magical security." "There might be," Graves said slowly, "but it would require cooperation from Chief Warlock Dumbledore. And he's been resistant to discussing Mr. Potter's placement arrangement." "Resistant how?" "He arranged the original placement personally, outside normal ministry channels. He's maintained that Mr. Potter is safest where he is, and that any change to the arrangement could have catastrophic consequences for the boy's security." Andromeda felt a flash of the same anger that had driven her to defy her family's expectations 23 years ago. And he's been content to let a child live in a cupboard for 10 years because it was convenient for his grand strategy? "Mrs. Tonks," Mitchell said carefully, "I understand your frustration, but Chief Warlock Dumbledore is one of the most powerful and respected figures in the wizarding world. Challenging his decisions isn't something that's undertaken lightly." "Then perhaps it's time someone started undertaking it more often," Ted said quietly, "especially when those decisions involve the welfare of children." Graves looked between them, assessing their determination. "If you're serious about pursuing custody, we'll need to prepare the strongest possible case. Documentation of Harry's current condition, evidence of the Dursleys' unsuitable care, character references for yourselves, financial statements proving your ability to support him. And we'll need to develop a comprehensive plan for maintaining his magical security in your care." "What would that plan involve?" "Ward schemes for your home, security protocols for his daily activities, coordination with Aura oversight if necessary. The Wizengamot will want to know that you can provide not just love and stability, but also the kind of protection that a child of his prominence requires." The scope of what they were considering began to crystallize for Andromeda. This wasn't just about taking in a neglected child. It was about accepting responsibility for the most famous child in the wizarding world, with all the complications and dangers that entailed. It meant living under scrutiny, accepting official oversight, and potentially making their own daughter a target for anyone who might want to harm Harry Potter. But it also meant that a 10-year-old boy who had spent his entire life believing he was unwanted might finally learn what it felt like to be part of a real family. "How do we start?" she asked. Graves smiled for the first time since the meeting had begun. "We start with a formal petition to the Wizengamot requesting emergency custody review. I'll draft the initial paperwork, and we can file it by the end of the week." "And then?" "Then we prove that Harry Potter deserves better than what he's had, and that you're the right people to give it to him." As they left the office, Andromeda felt the weight of what they were attempting settle over her like a heavy cloak. They were challenging not just a legal arrangement, but the decisions of one of the most powerful wizards alive, the inertia of a governmental system that preferred convenience to justice, and magical protections that had kept a child alive but miserable for a decade. But they were also offering something that Harry had never had: a choice, the chance to decide for himself whether he wanted to be part of their family, to see if the connection they'd felt during their brief meeting could grow into something permanent and meaningful. As they walked through Diagon Alley toward the Floo connection that would take them home, Andromeda found herself thinking about Sirius, sitting in Azkaban while his godson lived in a cupboard, and about all the ways that the wizarding world's priorities had gone catastrophically wrong. It was time to start fixing some of those mistakes, one child at a time. Harry was sitting in the foster family's small but comfortable living room, trying to focus on the book he'd been given, when Mrs. Patterson came to find him, with an expression that suggested something important was about to happen. "Harry, love," she said gently, "there are some people here to see you. Family members who've been wanting to meet you." Family members. The word sent a strange flutter through Harry's chest, part excitement, part terror. In the week since he'd been removed from Privet Drive, he'd begun to understand that the word family might mean something different than what he'd always known. Mrs. Patterson and her husband had shown him what adults could be like when they actually wanted a child around, when they weren't constantly reminded of their generosity in housing an unwanted burden. But these were blood relatives, people who shared some connection to his parents, to the part of his identity that had always been shrouded in silence and half-truths. People who might look at him and see something other than a freak who caused inconvenient problems. He followed Mrs. Patterson to the front hall, where 3 adults were waiting with Miss Chen, who had been overseeing his placement since the zoo incident. 2 of the adults were clearly a married couple, a man with greying hair and kind eyes, and a woman who looked to be around Aunt Petunia's age, but carried herself with completely different energy. Where Petunia was all sharp angles and barely suppressed irritation, this woman radiated warmth and competence, like someone who was used to taking care of people because she wanted to, not because she had to. The third person was much younger, probably only a few years older than Harry himself, though she carried herself with the confidence of someone much more mature. She had bright pink hair that definitely hadn't come from any bottle Harry had ever seen, and when she caught him staring at it, she grinned and let it shift through several different colors before settling on a vibrant purple. "Watch her, Harry," she said cheerfully. "I'm Tonks. Well, Nymphadora Tonks, but nobody calls me that unless they want me to hex them. I'm your cousin, sort of. It's complicated." She gestured at the woman beside her. "This is my mum, Andromeda, and my dad, Ted." Harry found himself staring at Andromeda Tonks, trying to process what he was seeing. She had the kind of face that belonged in the formal portraits he'd glimpsed in the houses of Dudley's wealthier school friends: aristocratic bone structure, intelligent dark eyes, the bearing of someone who came from old money and good breeding. But there was nothing cold or distant about her expression. When she looked at him, her face softened into something that might have been pain, or sympathy, or both. "Hello, Harry," she said, her voice much gentler than he'd expected. "I'm very glad to finally meet you." Ted Tonks stepped forward, extending a hand that Harry shook uncertainly. "We've been looking forward to this, Harry. We're sorry it took so long for us to find you." Find him. As if they'd been looking, as if his absence from their lives had been a problem they wanted to solve rather than a relief they were grateful for. The concept was so foreign that Harry had trouble processing it. "Miss Chen says you might want to take care of me," he said carefully. testing the words to see if they sounded as impossible spoken aloud as they did in his head. Andromeda crouched down so she was at his eye level, studying his face with the kind of attention that made him want to squirm. But it wasn't the uncomfortable scrutiny he was used to from adults looking for signs of freakishness or misbehavior. It was the way someone might look at a precious thing they thought they'd lost forever. "We would be honored to take care of you, Harry," she said seriously. "But more than that, we'd like you to be part of our family. Really part of it. Not just someone we house and feed, but someone who belongs with us." Belongs. Another word that hit him like a physical blow. Harry had never belonged anywhere, never been more than an unwanted obligation that people fulfilled because they had to. The idea that someone might actively want him to belong with them was almost too overwhelming to contemplate. "Are you really magical?" he asked instead, because that seemed like safer ground. Tonks laughed, a sound full of genuine delight. "Are we magical? Harry, you just watched me change my hair from pink to purple to—" She paused dramatically and let her hair shift to exactly the same messy black as his own. "This. What do you think?" "But how—" Harry started. "Metamorph magus," Ted explained. "It's a very rare magical ability. Tonks can change her appearance at will, and you—" He gestured at Harry with evident pride. "You made a snake's glass cage disappear and talked to the snake itself. That's some pretty impressive magic for someone with no training." The casual way he said it, as if Harry's freakishness was something to be celebrated rather than hidden or punished, made Harry's chest feel tight with an emotion he couldn't name. "The snake said thank you," Harry said quietly. "It wanted to go to Brazil." "Of course it did," Andromeda said matter-of-factly. "Boas are from Brazil originally. It probably spent its whole life dreaming of seeing its homeland." She said it as if talking to snakes was perfectly normal, as if understanding what they wanted and helping them get it was exactly what any decent person would do. Harry stared at her, trying to figure out if she was making fun of him or if she really meant it. "Harry," Miss Chen said gently, "Mrs. Tonks and her family would like to take you to see your old house today. Just for a visit, to collect your belongings and say goodbye. Would you be all right with that?" Going back to Privet Drive. The idea made Harry's stomach clench with anxiety, but also with something that might have been anticipation. If these people, his family, they said they wanted to be his family, came with him, maybe it would be different. Maybe the Dursleys wouldn't be able to make him feel small and worthless if he had magical relatives standing beside him. "Okay," he said. The drive to Little Whinging was quiet, with Harry squeezed between Ted and Tonks in the back seat of Miss Chen's official car, while Andromeda rode in the front. But it wasn't the oppressive silence he was used to from car trips with the Dursleys. Ted pointed out landmarks and made gentle conversation, while Tonks entertained herself by making her features shift in small ways, her nose changing shape, her eyes cycling through different colors, her hair growing longer and shorter by turns. "Does it hurt?" Harry asked, fascinated despite his nervousness. "Not at all," Tonks said. "It's like flexing a muscle, except the muscle happens to be my face, or my hair, or whatever I'm changing." She demonstrated by making her ears grow pointed, then return to normal. Takes a bit of concentration at first, but after a while, it's as easy as blinking. "Could I learn to do it?" Tonks grinned at him. "Probably not the same way I do it. Metamorph magus ability is something you're born with. But there are other kinds of transformation magic you could learn once you start school. Transfiguration, for instance. You could probably turn a matchstick into a needle or a beetle into a button." The idea that he might go to a school where transforming objects was a normal part of the curriculum seemed like something from a dream. Harry had never imagined that his freakishness might be not just accepted somewhere, but actually taught and refined. As they pulled up outside number 4, Privet Drive, Harry felt the familiar weight of the place settle over him like a heavy blanket. The house looked exactly the same as it always had, neat, ordinary, aggressively normal, but somehow smaller than he remembered, less imposing. Maybe it was having magical relatives beside him, or maybe it was knowing that he didn't have to stay here, that this was just a visit to collect his things before going somewhere else, somewhere better. Aunt Petunia opened the door before they could knock, her face pale and pinched with the kind of expression she usually wore when she was expecting very bad news. Her eyes fixed immediately on Andromeda, and Harry saw something like recognition flicker across her features. "Mrs. Dursley," Miss Chen said formally, "we're here to collect Harry's belongings and complete the transition process. These are his relatives, Mr. and Mrs. Tonks, and their daughter." Petunia's gaze darted between the 3 magical family members, clearly trying to process their presence in her determinedly ordinary world. "I suppose you'd better come in," she said finally, stepping aside with obvious reluctance. The hallway felt even smaller with 5 adults crowded into it, and Harry was acutely aware of how shabby and cramped everything looked compared to the comfortable house where he'd been staying with Mrs. Patterson. Dudley appeared at the top of the stairs, peering down with unconcealed curiosity at the visitors who had clearly not come to admire his birthday presents. "Harry's things are upstairs," Petunia said quickly, as if she could rush them through this process and get them out of her house before too much strangeness contaminated her carefully maintained normalcy. "Actually," Andromeda said, her voice pleasant but with an edge of steel underneath, "I believe Harry's room is down here, under the stairs." The words fell into the hallway like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that seemed to touch everyone present. Petunia's face flushed an unbecoming shade of red, while Dudley made a small sound of surprise from his perch on the stairs. "That's not a room," Ted said quietly, staring at the cupboard door with an expression of barely controlled anger. "That's a storage space." "It was perfectly adequate," Petunia said defensively. "Harry never complained." Tonks had gone very still beside Harry, her hair shifting from purple to a deep, angry red without any apparent conscious control. "He was 10 years old," she said, her voice flat. 10-year-old children don't complain about being locked in cupboards because they don't understand that they deserve better. Andromeda moved to the cupboard door and opened it, revealing the small, dark space with its narrow cot and collection of broken toys. The silence that followed was deafening. "This is where my cousin lived for 10 years, she said finally, her voice carrying the kind of quiet fury that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. "This is what passes for adequate care in your family." "Now see here," Petunia started, but Ted cut her off. "Mrs. Dursley, Harry won't be returning to this house. Ever. I want to make that very clear. Whether the formal custody arrangements work out in our favor or not, he will not be coming back here." Petunia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, apparently unable to find words to respond to this declaration. "Harry," Andromeda said gently, "would you like to collect your things? We'll help you." Harry nodded and stepped into the cupboard that had been his world for so long. It looked impossibly small now, especially with 3 magical relatives standing in the hallway watching him gather his few possessions, his broken toys, his too small clothes, the few books he'd managed to accumulate over the years. It all fit easily into a single bag. When he emerged, Tonks was waiting with something in her hands. "Here," she said, offering him what looked like a small, carved wooden object. It's a magical camera. Point it at something and press the button, and it'll take a picture that moves. Thought you might like to have some photos of your new family. A magical camera. Photos that moved. Harry accepted the gift with hands that weren't quite steady, overwhelmed by the casual generosity of it, the assumption that he would want pictures of them, that they expected to be part of his life, long enough for photos to matter. As they prepared to leave, Andromeda paused in the doorway and looked back at Petunia. "Mrs. Dursley," she said quietly, "I hope someday you'll understand what you've missed. Harry is a remarkable child, and you could have been part of something wonderful if you'd chosen to love him instead of resenting him." Then they were walking back to the car, Harry carrying his one small bag of possessions and the magical camera, surrounded by people who had driven across London just to make sure he knew he wasn't alone anymore. As they pulled away from Privet Drive, Harry looked back at number 4 one last time and realized that he wasn't seeing it as his home anymore. It was just a house where he used to live before his real family found him. Petunia Dursley sat at her kitchen table, staring at the legal documents spread before her like tarot cards predicting an unwelcome future. Miss Chen sat across from her, pen poised over a notepad, while Andromeda Tonks occupied the chair that had always been Vernon's spot at the head of the table. The symbolism wasn't lost on Petunia. Her ordinary world was being systematically dismantled by forces she'd spent 31 years trying to ignore. "The blood protection," Miss Chen was saying, consulting her own set of papers, "is the primary complication in arranging permanent custody transfer. According to the magical experts we've consulted, Harry needs to maintain some legal connection to this house in order to preserve the magical ward that's kept him safe for the past 10 years. Andromeda leaned forward, her dark eyes fixed on Petunia with uncomfortable intensity. "Which means that despite everything you've put him through, we need your cooperation to keep him alive." The words stung, but Petunia couldn't deny their accuracy. She'd never wanted to understand the magical nonsense that Dumbledore had tried to explain in his letter 10 years ago, but the basic facts were clear enough. As long as Harry could call number 4, Privet Drive, his home, he was protected from the same dark magic that had killed his parents. Remove him completely from her care, and that protection might collapse. What exactly would this cooperation involve? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Miss Chen consulted her notes. The proposed arrangement would give Mrs. Tonks full physical custody of Harry, with legal responsibility for his daily care, education, and medical needs. However, you would retain nominal guardianship status, and Harry would need to return here periodically to maintain the magical connection. How periodically? Once a month, Andromeda said, for a few hours. Supervised, of course, and only long enough to satisfy the magical requirements. Petunia felt something twist in her stomach at the thought. A monthly reminder of her failure, a regular intrusion of the magical world she'd tried so hard to shut out. Harry would return every month, no longer the cowed, grateful child who'd been content with a cupboard and leftover meals, but as the ward of people who actually wanted him. People who would see exactly what she'd done to him, month after month, year after year. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Miss Chen's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was steel underneath. "Then we'll have to explore other options for maintaining Harry's protection while removing him from your care entirely. The magical authorities have indicated there are alternative approaches, though they're significantly more complex and potentially risky." Alternative approaches. Petunia didn't know what those might involve, but she understood a threat when she heard one. Cooperate with this arrangement, or face something worse. "Where is Harry during all this?" she asked, realizing that the boy who was the subject of all these negotiations hadn't been seen since they'd collected his belongings from the cupboard. "He's in the garden with Tonks," Andromeda said. "We thought it would be better if the adults handled the legal details first." Through the kitchen window, Petunia could see Harry sitting on the small patch of grass behind the house, listening intently while the pink-haired girl, Tonks, she'd said to call her, demonstrated some kind of magical ability with a handful of flowers. As Petunia watched, the girl's hair shifted from pink to the same purple as the petunias in the flower bed, and Harry laughed, actually laughed, with delight. When was the last time she'd heard Harry laugh? Petunia couldn't remember. Certainly not in the past few years, when he'd learned to keep quiet and stay out of sight, and never, ever draw attention to his freakishness. But there he was, laughing like any normal 10-year-old boy, because someone was showing him magic instead of punishing him for it. "He looks happy," she said, surprised by the wistfulness in her own voice. Andromeda followed her gaze to the window. "He is happy. For the first time in his life, probably, he's with people who see his magic as a gift instead of a curse." The implied criticism hit home, but Petunia found herself unable to summon the defensive anger that usually rose when people questioned her treatment of Harry. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to shame. "I never wanted him," she said quietly. "When Dumbledore left him on my doorstep, I never wanted any of it. The magic, the responsibility, the constant reminder of what Lily had chosen over her own family." Andromeda's expression softened slightly. "But you took him in anyway. What choice did I have? He was a baby. Lily's baby." Petunia's voice caught slightly on her sister's name. "And Dumbledore said he'd be safe here, that the protection would keep him alive where nothing else could. So you sacrificed your own comfort to keep him safe," Miss Chen said. "That's not nothing, Mrs. Dursley." Petunia stared at the social worker, surprised by this interpretation of her actions. She'd never thought of taking Harry in as a sacrifice. It had simply been the only option that didn't involve actively harming a child. But perhaps there was something to be said for 30 years of keeping him fed and housed and alive, even if she'd failed at making him feel wanted or loved. "The thing is," Andromeda said carefully, "this arrangement would actually make things easier for you. Harry would have a proper home with people who want him, but you'd maintain the legal connection that keeps the protection active. You'd still be fulfilling your obligation to Lily, but without the daily burden of caring for a magical child." The daily burden. It was a cruel but accurate way to describe what Harry had been for the Dursley family. A constant source of anxiety and inconvenience, a reminder of the magical world they'd tried to pretend didn't exist. But the thought of him being gone, of Number 4 returning to its ordinary routine without the constant undercurrent of resentment and suppressed magic, felt strangely hollow. "What about Dudley?" Petunia asked. "How do I explain to him that Harry is leaving but will still visit every month?" "You tell him the truth," Miss Chen said, "that Harry is going to live with relatives who can take better care of him, but that he'll still be part of your extended family." Part of the family. Petunia almost laughed at the irony. Harry would become part of the Dursley family only after he left it, only after he found people who actually treated him like family. "There's something else," Andromeda said. "Harry will need to understand why he has to maintain this connection to your house. He's going to have questions about why he can't just leave and never come back." "What kind of questions?" "Why the protection matters, what it does, why his mother's sacrifice is still keeping him safe." Andromeda paused. "He doesn't know anything about his parents' deaths, does he? Nothing about the magical world or what happened the night they died. Petunia shook her head. We told him they died in a car crash. I thought it was better if he didn't know about the other business. Mrs. Dursley, Miss Chen said gently, Harry is going to need to understand his history if he's going to live successfully in the magical world. He can't spend his whole life ignorant of who he is and what he represents to other magical people. The weight of what they were asking began to settle over Petunia like a lead blanket. Not only would she have to accept Harry's monthly returns, she would have to accept his transformation from the quiet, suppressed child she'd raised into someone who understood magic and power, and all the things she'd tried to protect him from by keeping him ignorant. He'll be different, she said. When he comes back, he'll be different. Yes, Andromeda agreed. He'll be confident and happy and proud of who he is. He'll understand that magic is a gift, not a curse. And he'll probably want to talk about his experiences and his education and the magical world he's becoming part of. All the things Petunia had spent 10 years trying to prevent. All the reminders of Lily and the choice she'd made to abandon her family for the magical world that had ultimately killed her. I don't think I can do this, Petunia whispered. Andromeda reached across the table and covered Petunia's hand with her own. It was the first genuinely compassionate gesture anyone had offered her since this whole crisis had begun, and it nearly undid her completely. Mrs. Dursley, Andromeda said quietly, I know this is difficult. I know we're asking you to accept things you've spent years trying to avoid, but Harry needs this arrangement to work, and despite everything that's happened, I believe you still want what's best for him. Do I? Petunia wondered. After 10 years of resenting his presence, of treating him as an unwelcome burden, did she actually care what happened to Harry Potter? But watching him laugh in the garden, seeing him light up when someone showed him kindness instead of merely tolerating his existence, she thought maybe she did. If I agree to this, she said slowly, what guarantees do I have that you won't just disappear with him? That you won't decide the monthly visits are too inconvenient and find some other way to maintain the protection? You have my word, Andromeda said simply, and you have the legal documents that make this arrangement official. But more than that, you have the fact that we want Harry to understand his full history, including the sacrifice his mother's sister made to keep him safe. The sacrifice his mother's sister made. Another reframing of her actions that Petunia had never considered. Perhaps taking Harry in hadn't been just an obligation or a burden. Perhaps it had been a form of love, imperfect and resentful and begrudging, but love nonetheless. All right, she said finally. I'll agree to the arrangement. But I have conditions. Miss Chen looked up from her notepad. What conditions? The visits are supervised, as you said, and brief, no more than a few hours. And if Harry ever becomes disruptive, or if he brings any of his magical business into my house, the arrangement ends. Agreed, Andromeda said immediately, though I think you'll find that Harry is more polite and well-behaved when he feels wanted and secure. Petunia nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Magic had a way of seeping into everything it touched, transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary, whether you wanted it to or not. Monthly visits from a magical child who understood his power and his place in a world she'd never wanted to acknowledge would change number 4, Privet Drive, in ways she couldn't predict or control. But perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Perhaps a little magic, carefully contained and properly supervised, was better than the constant undercurrent of suppressed power and resentment that had defined the house for the past 10 years. As they signed the papers that would formalize the arrangement, Petunia found herself thinking about Lily, wondering if her sister would approve of this solution. Harry would finally have the magical family and education that his heritage entitled him to, but he would still be connected to the non-magical relatives who had kept him safe through the most dangerous years of his childhood. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't what any of them would have chosen under ideal circumstances. But it was a way forward that protected both Harry's magical needs and his physical safety, while allowing Petunia to fulfill her obligation to her sister's memory without sacrificing her own sanity. Looking out at Harry in the garden, still laughing with his magical cousin, Petunia thought that maybe, for the first time in 10 years, she'd made a decision that served his best interests instead of simply her own convenience. It was, she reflected, probably long overdue. Harry stood in the doorway of what Andromeda had called his room, trying to process the idea that this space, this entire room, belonged to him. It had an actual window that looked out onto a small garden where flowers grew in neat, colourful rows. There was a real bed with a wooden frame and a thick mattress, covered with a quilt that looked handmade and soft. A desk sat under the window, empty and waiting for whatever he might want to put on it. Bookshelves lined one wall, mostly empty, but with a few volumes that Andromeda had said were starter books for young wizards. "It's not much," Ted said from behind him, "but it's yours for as long as you want it. For as long as you want it." Harry had never owned space before. Never had anywhere that was his by right rather than by grudging permission. The cupboard under the stairs had been his by default, because there was nowhere else to put him. This room was his, because people had chosen to give it to him, because they wanted him to have somewhere that belonged to him alone. "It's perfect," he said, and meant it. Nymphadora. Tonks, she'd insisted again when he'd tried to use her full name, bounded up the stairs behind them, her hair currently a cheerful yellow that matched the sunflowers in the garden. "Mum transfigured the desk specially for you," she announced. "It used to be an old trunk, but she thought you might like somewhere to do homework when you start school properly." Homework, school. The idea that he might actually attend the magical school he'd heard whispered references to was still too large and impossible for Harry to fully grasp. But the desk made it feel more real somehow, more like something that might actually happen to him rather than something that happened to other people. "Have you been to the magical school?" he asked Tonks. "Hogwarts? Course I have. Just finished, actually. 7 years of the best magic they can teach you." She plopped down on his bed, and grinned at him. "You'll love it. Well, most of it. Potions can be a bit grim, but charms is brilliant, and defense against the dark arts is properly exciting." The casual way she talked about subjects like charms and defense against the dark arts made Harry's head spin slightly. These were real things, subjects he could learn, skills he could develop, not freakish accidents to be ashamed of, but actual magical abilities that people studied and practiced and took pride in. "What's defense against the dark arts?" he asked. Ted settled into the chair at the desk, looking comfortable and relaxed in a way that made the room feel even more welcoming. "It's exactly what it sounds like, learning to protect yourself against harmful magic. Curse-breaking shield charms, recognizing dangerous magical creatures, essential skills for any witch or wizard." "But I don't know any magic," Harry said. "I mean, real magic. The things that happen around me, they just happen. I can't control them." "That's completely normal," Andromeda said from the doorway, where she'd been watching them settle in. "Magic often manifests randomly in children before they receive proper training. The fact that yours is so strong suggests you'll be quite powerful once you learn to channel it properly." powerful. Another concept that sat strangely in Harry's mind. He'd never thought of his freakishness as power. It was just something that happened to him, something that caused problems and made people angry. But the way Andromeda said it, with a note of pride in her voice, made it sound like something to be celebrated rather than suppressed. "Could you teach me some magic now?" he asked hopefully. Tonks laughed, but not unkindly. "Afraid not, Harry. There are laws about underage magic. You're not supposed to do spells outside of school until you turn 17. But we can tell you about magic, show you some of what's possible." She demonstrated by letting her hair cycle through several colors, then shifting her nose from its normal shape to something more pointed, then back again. "Metamorphmagus abilities aren't considered regular magic," she explained. "It's more like having brown eyes or being tall, a natural trait rather than a learned skill." "Can you change into animals?" Harry asked, fascinated. "No, that's a different kind of magic entirely. Metamorph magic can only change human features, hair, eye color, facial structure, height within limits. But watch this." She closed her eyes and concentrated, and slowly her entire face shifted until she looked exactly like Harry himself, down to his messy black hair and green eyes. Harry stared at his own face, looking back at him from Tonks's body, feeling thoroughly unsettled. That's really strange." Tonks shifted back to her normal appearance, grinning. "I know. Mum says it used to drive her mad when I was little, because I'd copy other people's faces, and she'd forget which one was really me." "Speaking of which," Andromeda said, entering the room properly and settling on the edge of the bed, "there are some things about our family that you probably ought to know. About where you fit in the magical world, and why Ted and I ended up together." She looked thoughtful for a moment, as if deciding where to begin. "Your father, James Potter, came from an old wizarding family. Not as old as some, but well respected. Your mother, Lily, was like Ted. Muggle-born, raised by non-magical parents, but incredibly talented at magic. And me? I come from a very old wizarding family indeed. One with some rather unpleasant ideas about blood purity and the superiority of pure-blood wizards." Ted reached over and squeezed her hand. "Andromeda was disowned by her family when she married me. Cut off completely, burned off the family tree, forbidden to contact her parents or sisters ever again." "Why?" Harry asked. "Because I was Muggle-born," Ted said simply. "Because my parents were ordinary people who knew nothing about magic, and Andromeda's family believed that made me inferior. They thought magical ability was something that could be diluted or contaminated by contact with non-magical people." Andromeda's expression darkened. "Which is complete nonsense, of course. Some of the most powerful witches and wizards I've ever known were Muggle-born, your mother included. But my family, the Blacks, they've always believed that pure wizard blood makes them inherently superior to everyone else. What happened to them? Your family, I mean. My parents are dead now. My sister Bellatrix is in Azkaban, wizard prison, for supporting the Dark Lord who killed your parents. My other sister, Narcissa, married another pure-blood extremist, and probably shares all the same poisonous beliefs I grew up with." Andromeda's voice was matter-of-fact, but Harry could see the pain underneath. "The only family member I truly miss is my cousin Sirius." "Sirius Black," Harry said, recognizing the name from whispered conversations he'd overheard between the adults over the past few days. "Yes, he's your godfather, actually. Your father named him as such when you were born. Sirius was the one member of our family who rejected the blood purity nonsense even before I did. But he's in Azkaban, too, convicted of betraying your parents to the Dark Lord. Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. Did he? Betray them? Andromeda exchanged a look with Ted that Harry couldn't quite interpret. The evidence suggested he did, she said carefully. But Sirius and we understood each other, in a way. We were both the rebels in a family that demanded absolute conformity. I find it hard to believe he would have betrayed people he loved. But stranger things have happened under the influence of dark magic. So my godfather is in prison, and my parents are dead, and I've been living with relatives who hate magic, Harry said, trying to piece together the fragments of his history. How did I end up with the Dursleys in the first place? Ted leaned back in the chair, looking troubled. That was Dumbledore's decision. Albus Dumbledore, the chief warlock of the Wizengamot and headmaster of Hogwarts. He arranged your placement with your mother's sister immediately after your parents' deaths, claiming it would keep you safest from any remaining supporters of the Dark Lord. And no one questioned this decision? No one was in a position to, Andromeda said grimly. Dumbledore is one of the most powerful and respected figures in the wizarding world. When he says something is necessary for the greater good, people generally trust his judgment. Even when it means leaving a child in a cupboard for 10 years? The silence that followed his question was heavy with implication. Finally, Ted spoke. I don't think anyone knew about the cupboard, Harry. I think most people assumed you were being properly cared for by loving relatives who would give you a normal, happy childhood away from the pressures of magical fame. Magical fame? Tonks sat up straighter, her hair shifting to a subdued brown that suggested the seriousness of what she was about to say. Harry, you're famous in the wizarding world. Really famous. When the Dark Lord killed your parents and tried to kill you, something went wrong. Instead of dying, you somehow deflected his killing curse back at him, destroying his body and breaking his power. You're the only person known to have survived the killing curse, and you were just a baby when you did it. The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He was famous. Famous for something he couldn't even remember, something that had happened when he was too young to understand what was occurring. Famous for surviving while his parents died, for being marked with a lightning bolt scar that apparently meant something significant to every witch and wizard in Britain. That's why the scar, he asked, touching the thin mark on his forehead that he'd always assumed was just an accident from his early childhood. That's where the curse hit you, Andromeda confirmed. It should have killed you instantly. The fact that it didn't... Well, there are theories, but no one really understands how you managed it. Harry felt overwhelmed by the weight of information, the sudden shift from being an unwanted burden to being someone the entire magical world knew about and talked about. Do people expect things from me? Because I'm famous? Some do, Ted said honestly. But that's not something you need to worry about right now. You're 10 years old, Harry. You deserve to be a child, to learn about magic because it's wonderful and exciting, not because you have some destiny to fulfill. Tonks bounced slightly on the bed, her hair brightening to a cheerful orange. Besides, you'll have loads of time to figure out who you want to be. Hogwarts is brilliant for that. You'll learn what you're good at, what you enjoy, what kind of magic speaks to you, and you'll make friends with other kids who understand what it's like to be magical. Friends. Another concept that felt foreign and wonderful. Harry had never had friends before. Dudley and his gang had made sure of that at school, and the Dursleys had never encouraged social connections that might lead to awkward questions about Harry's living situation. What if they only want to be friends with me because I'm famous? He asked. Then they're not real friends, Andromeda said firmly. Real friends care about who you are, not what you've done or what people say about you. And I suspect you'll find that most children your age are much more interested in Quidditch scores and homework than they are in ancient history, even if you're part of that history. What's Quidditch? Tonks's eyes lit up with delight. Oh, Harry, you're going to love Quidditch. It's a sport played on flying broomsticks, with 4 balls and 7 players per side. I played chaser for Hufflepuff while I was at school. That's the position that tries to score goals with the big red ball called the quaffle. Flying broomsticks. The idea was so impossibly magical that Harry could barely wrap his mind around it. But then again, a week ago he wouldn't have believed that people could change their hair color at will or make glass disappear with their thoughts. Magic, it seemed, was far more vast and wonderful than he'd ever imagined. As the evening wore on and they continued to talk about magic and family and the future that was opening up before him, Harry found himself thinking about the difference between this house and number 4, Privet Drive. Here, magic was something to be celebrated and shared. Questions were encouraged rather than punished. His happiness seemed to matter to the adults around him, not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as something genuinely important to their own well-being. For the first time in his life, Harry was beginning to understand what family was supposed to feel like. The Wizengamot chamber was designed to intimidate. Ancient stone walls rose up to a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows, while tiers of wooden benches formed a semicircle around a single chair placed in the center of the floor. Purple-robed figures occupied most of the benches, their faces grave and attentive, as they prepared to decide the fate of the most famous child in the wizarding world. Andromeda sat in the witness area, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their slight trembling. She'd dressed in her most formal robes for this hearing, deep blue wool that spoke of respectability and stability, and had spent the morning reviewing her testimony with the legal advocate the ministry had assigned to Harry's case. But no amount of preparation could fully ease the weight of what was happening here. This wasn't simply a custody hearing. This was the wizarding world's acknowledgement that its most celebrated hero had been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect him, and that the system which had placed him with abusive relatives needed to be fundamentally reconsidered. Chief Warlock Augusta Longbottom called the session to order from her position at the center of the top tier, her stern face and iron-grey hair giving her an air of uncompromising authority. We are here today to consider the petition for emergency custody transfer filed by Andromeda Tonks regarding Harry James Potter, currently ward of the state pending resolution of this matter. Andromeda felt a flutter of nerves at being named directly, but she kept her expression composed. Around the chamber, 50 members of the Wizengamot watched with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood the precedent this case might set for future child welfare decisions. Before we hear testimony, Longbottom continued, I want to acknowledge that this case involves unusual circumstances requiring careful consideration of both magical law and child welfare principles. The Chief Warlock's office has reviewed all submitted evidence and testimony, and we are prepared to render a decision based on the best interests of the child in question. The legal advocate representing Harry's interests, a competent-looking witch in her 50s named Solicitor Davies, rose from her seat at the advocate's table. Chief Warlock, members of the Wizengamot, I ask the Chamber's permission to present evidence regarding the conditions under which Harry Potter has been living for the past 10 years, and to demonstrate why immediate custody transfer is not only appropriate but essential for his welfare. Permission granted. Please proceed. Davies activated a magical projection that displayed a series of photographs on the chamber's far wall. The first image showed the cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive, a space so small and cramped that several Wizengamot members visibly recoiled when they saw it. "For nearly 10 years, Davies said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, Harry Potter has lived in this storage cupboard. No window, no proper ventilation, barely enough space for a grown man to stand upright. This was not temporary emergency housing. This was his permanent residence from age 1 to age 10. The next photograph showed Harry's few possessions, the broken toys, the ill-fitting hand-me-down clothes, the single thin blanket that had constituted his bedding. Then came documentation from the social services investigation, evidence of irregular meals, lack of medical care, systematic exclusion from family activities, and the emotional abuse inherent in treating a child as an unwanted burden. The Muggle social worker who assessed the situation, Davies continued, described this as one of the most clear-cut cases of child neglect she had encountered in 15 years of professional practice. The evidence is unambiguous. Harry Potter was not being cared for by his maternal relatives. He was being housed by them, minimally fed by them, and systematically devalued by them. Andromeda watched the faces around the chamber as the evidence was presented. Some showed shock, others anger, and a few displayed what looked like shame, as if they were recognizing their own culpability in never questioning what had happened to the boy they'd all assumed was living a normal, happy childhood. When Davies finished presenting the evidence of neglect, she moved on to the second phase of her argument. The question before this chamber is not whether Harry Potter should be removed from the Dursley household. That decision has already been made by the appropriate authorities. The question is whether Mrs. Andromeda Tonks is a suitable guardian, and whether the proposed custody arrangement adequately protects both Harry's welfare and his magical security. This was where Andromeda's own qualifications would be examined, where every detail of her life and character would be scrutinized to determine her fitness as a guardian. She'd submitted to extensive background checks, character interviews, financial assessments, and magical competency evaluations. The results had been overwhelmingly positive, but she still felt nervous about having her personal life dissected in front of 50 strangers. "Mrs. Tonks," Davies said, turning toward the witness area, "please approach the testimony chair." Andromeda walked across the chamber floor on legs that felt steadier than she'd expected, settling into the ancient wooden chair that had heard testimony in some of the most important legal cases in wizarding history. The weight of that history pressed down on her as she placed her hand on the truth stone, feeling the familiar tingle of magic that would make deception impossible. "Mrs. Tonks," Davies began, "please state your relationship to Harry Potter for the record." "Harry is my second cousin, once removed through the Black family line. His father, James Potter's godfather, was my cousin Sirius Black, and Harry himself is Sirius's godson. And your current family situation?" "I am married to Edward Tonks, a Muggle-born wizard who works for the Ministry's Muggle Liaison Office. We have one daughter, Nymphadora, who is 18 years old and recently graduated from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." The questions continued, covering every aspect of Andromeda's life that might be relevant to Harry's care. Her home, her finances, her experience raising a magical child, her understanding of the unique pressures that would come with being Harry Potter's guardian. Davies was thorough but respectful, building a comprehensive picture of a stable, loving household that could provide exactly what Harry had never had. "Mrs. Tonks," Davies said finally, "there has been considerable discussion about the magical protections currently surrounding Harry Potter, protections that were established by his mother's sacrifice and sealed by his placement with his aunt. Can you explain how your proposed custody arrangement addresses these protections?" This was the most complex part of the legal argument, the point where magical law intersected with practical child welfare considerations. Andromeda took a careful breath before answering. The blood protection established by Lily Potter's sacrifice requires Harry to be able to call the place where his mother's blood dwells his home. After extensive consultation with magical lore experts and ward specialists, we have developed an arrangement that preserves this protection while removing Harry from an abusive environment. She explained the monthly visits to Privet Drive, the legal documentation that would maintain Harry's nominal connection to the Dursley household, and the ward schemes that would ensure his magical security in his new home. It was a complex arrangement, but one that had been carefully crafted to satisfy both the letter and spirit of the protection requirements. And Harry's aunt, Petunia Dursley, has agreed to this arrangement? Yes. She has signed legal documents acknowledging her continued role in maintaining the blood protection while transferring primary custody and care responsibilities to my family. When Davies finished her examination, Chief Warlock Longbottom opened the floor for questions from the Wizengamot members. Most were straightforward queries about the practical details of the custody arrangement. But Wizard Fudge, a round-faced man who served as Minister for Magic, raised a more pointed concern. Mrs. Tonks, this case has potentially significant implications for how we handle the welfare of magical children placed with non-magical relatives. Some might argue that your petition represents an indictment of decisions made by respected members of this very body. How do you respond to concerns that approving this custody transfer might undermine confidence in our existing child placement procedures? Andromeda felt the truth stone warm under her hand, compelling honesty even as she chose her words carefully. Minister Fudge, I have great respect for this body and for the difficult decisions its members must make under emergency circumstances. Chief Warlock Dumbledore's placement of Harry with the Dursleys was made in good faith, with the primary goal of keeping him safe from those who might wish him harm. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But good intentions cannot excuse a failure to verify that a child is being properly cared for. Harry Potter was placed with relatives who resented his existence and were fundamentally opposed to everything he represented. No follow-up was conducted to ensure his welfare. No one checked to see if he was happy, healthy, or developing appropriately. The chamber was completely silent as she continued. This isn't about blame, Minister. It's about learning from our mistakes and ensuring that no child, famous or otherwise, is ever again placed in a situation where their basic needs are ignored for 10 years. Fudge nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with her response. A few other members asked procedural questions about the transition timeline and Harry's eventual education, but the substantive examination was complete. Chief Warlock Longbottom called for a 15-minute recess while the Wizengamot deliberated. Andromeda returned to the witness area, where Solicitor Davies offered quiet reassurance about the strength of their case. But the final decision rested with 50 people who might prioritize political considerations over a single child's welfare. When the session reconvened, Longbottom's expression was serious, but not grim. The Wizengamot has reviewed all evidence and testimony presented in this matter. We find that the petitioner, Mrs. Andromeda Tonks, has demonstrated both the motivation and capability to provide appropriate care for Harry Potter. We further find that the proposed custody arrangement adequately addresses the magical security concerns that have been raised. Andromeda's heart began to beat faster as Longbottom continued. Therefore, this body grants the petition for emergency custody transfer. Legal guardianship of Harry James Potter is hereby transferred to Andromeda Tonks, with all rights and responsibilities attendant to such guardianship. The blood protection arrangement, as detailed in the submitted documentation, is approved and shall remain in effect until Harry Potter reaches his majority." The words hit Andromeda like a physical force. Legal guardianship. Harry was officially, legally hers to protect and care for. The boy who had spent 10 years believing no one wanted him now had a family who had fought through the magical legal system to claim him. "Mrs. Tonks," Longbottom said, her stern expression softening slightly. "This chamber trusts that you understand the significance of what you have undertaken today. You are now responsible not only for the welfare of a child, but for the care of someone who represents hope and survival to our entire community." Andromeda stood, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle over her like a ceremonial robe. "I understand, Chief Warlock, and I promise this chamber that Harry Potter will never again have cause to doubt whether he is wanted and loved." As the Wizengamot members filed out of the chamber, Andromeda remained in her seat for a moment, letting the magnitude of what had just occurred wash over her. She was a mother again. Not just to Nymphadora, but to a brave, damaged boy who deserved every bit of love and security she could provide. It was time to go home and tell Harry that he truly belonged somewhere at last. Harry had been living with the Tonks family for 2 months when he finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been haunting him since his first week in their care. It came up on a quiet Sunday afternoon, while he and Andromeda were working in the garden together, her teaching him to identify the different magical plants she grew for her potion-making hobby. "Andromeda," he said carefully, testing a handful of soil to see if it was ready for the moonflower seeds they were planting. "You mentioned once that my godfather is your cousin, but you never really explained what happened to him." Andromeda's hands stilled over the seed packet she was holding. Harry had learned to recognize that particular pause. It was the way she reacted when he asked about something painful but important, something she wanted to answer honestly, but wasn't sure how to make gentle enough for a 10-year-old to understand. "Sirius," she said finally. "Yes, Sirius Black is your godfather, and he's my cousin. He's also currently serving a life sentence in Azkaban prison for crimes that most people believe he committed." "What kind of crimes?" Andromeda set down the seed packet and turned to face him fully, her dark eyes serious but not unkind. "The worst kind, Harry. He was convicted of betraying your parents to the Dark Lord and of killing 13 people when the Auras tried to arrest him." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. His godfather, the person his parents had chosen to care for him if anything happened to them, was a murderer, a traitor who had handed his parents over to be killed. "But," Harry said slowly, trying to process this information, "if he was my godfather, that means my parents trusted him. They must have loved him." "They did," Andromeda confirmed. "James and Lily trusted Sirius completely. He was James's best friend, practically a brother. When you were born, naming him as your godfather felt like the most natural thing in the world." "So what went wrong?" Andromeda was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. "The war was a terrible time, Harry. People were frightened, desperate, turning against friends and family members. The Dark Lord had ways of breaking people, of corrupting them or forcing them to do things they never would have chosen to do under normal circumstances. Do you think he really did it? Betray my parents?" It was the question that had been eating at Harry since he'd first learned about Sirius's existence. The idea that the person chosen to be his guardian had instead been responsible for his parents' deaths felt like a betrayal that cut even deeper than the Dursleys' neglect. Andromeda sighed, settling back on her heels in the dirt. "I don't know, Harry. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He was found at the scene, covered in blood, laughing while surrounded by the bodies of the people he'd allegedly killed. But, But Sirius was the rebel of our family, just like I was. He rejected everything the Blacks stood for, the pure blood supremacy, the dark magic, the willingness to use violence to maintain power. When I was disowned for marrying Ted, Sirius was the only family member who tried to maintain contact with me. He risked his own position in the family because he thought what they'd done to me was wrong. She paused, looking out over the garden toward the house where Ted and Nymphadora were visible through the kitchen window, arguing good-naturedly about something involving the Sunday roast. The Sirius I knew would have died before betraying people he loved, she said finally. But war changes people, Harry, and I hadn't seen him in months before your parents died. People can surprise you, sometimes in terrible ways. What's Azkaban like? Harry asked. Andromeda's expression darkened. It's the most horrible place in the wizarding world. The prison is guarded by creatures called Dementors, beings that feed on happiness and hope, that drain away every positive emotion and leave only despair behind. Prisoners in Azkaban are slowly driven mad by constant exposure to their worst memories and deepest fears. The description made Harry's stomach clench with horror. Whatever Sirius had or hadn't done, the idea of anyone being subjected to that kind of torment felt wrong. Has anyone ever escaped from Azkaban? No one in recorded history, Andromeda said. The Dementors make escape psychologically impossible long before it becomes physically impossible. Most prisoners lose the will to even try within the first few months. They worked in silence for a few minutes, planting the moonflower seeds in neat rows while Harry processed what he'd learned. Finally, he asked the question that was really bothering him. If Sirius hadn't been arrested, would I have lived with him instead of the Dursleys? Andromeda's hands stilled again. Most likely, yes. James and Lily's will named Sirius as your primary guardian. If he'd been available to care for you, there would have been no reason to place you anywhere else. So I would have grown up in the magical world, with someone who knew my parents and could tell me about them. Yes, the magnitude of what had been lost, not just his parents' lives, but the entire childhood he might have had, settled over Harry like a heavy blanket. If Sirius hadn't betrayed his parents, if he hadn't been arrested, Harry would have grown up knowing about magic from the beginning. He would have had stories about James and Lily, photographs that moved, an understanding of who he was and where he came from. Where would we have lived? He asked. Sirius has a house, Andromeda said. The family home in London. 12 Grimmauld Place. It's been empty since his arrest, just sitting there with all the black family artifacts and portraits and accumulated history. What's it like? Andromeda smiled slightly, though there was sadness in the expression. Dark, imposing, full of things that most decent people would find disturbing. The Blacks were never what you'd call a warm family, and their house reflects that. But Sirius could have changed it, made it into something better. He was already starting to reject the family's values when we were children. Nymphadora appeared in the garden doorway, her hair currently a cheerful pink that suggested she was in a good mood. Are you two going to spend the entire afternoon playing in the dirt, or are you planning to come in for tea? We're discussing family history, Andromeda said. Harry wanted to know about Sirius. Nymphadora's expression sobered immediately. She walked over and settled cross-legged on the grass beside them, apparently recognizing that this was a serious conversation that required her full attention. What did you tell him? She asked. The truth. That Sirius was his godfather. That he's in Azkaban for betraying Harry's parents, and that we don't know for certain whether he actually did what he was convicted of. Nymphadora nodded slowly. It's a hard truth. But Harry deserves to know. especially since he's old enough now to understand the complexities. "Do you remember him?" Harry asked. "Sirius, I mean." "A little," Nymphadora said. "He used to visit sometimes when I was very young, before the war got really bad. He was the fun relative, the one who'd teach me jokes that made Mum scowl and Dad laugh. He had this way of making everything seem like an adventure." "What kind of adventures?" "Nothing dangerous," Andromeda said quickly. "Sirius was irresponsible in some ways, but he would never have put a child at risk. He had a talent for finding magic in ordinary things, for making the mundane world seem full of possibilities." The description made Harry's chest ache with longing for something he'd never had, and now might never have. "Do you think he knows about me? About what happened with the Dursleys?" Andromeda and Nymphadora exchanged a look that Harry couldn't quite interpret. "Azkaban prisoners are allowed very limited contact with the outside world," Andromeda said carefully. "A few letters per year, heavily monitored by the guards. But given Sirius's status as a high-security prisoner, he probably doesn't know," Nymphadora finished gently. "The Ministry wouldn't see any reason to inform him about your living situation. As far as they're concerned, he forfeited any interest in your welfare when he committed the crimes he was convicted of." "Could we tell him?" Harry asked impulsively. "Could we write to him and let him know that I'm safe now, that I'm living with family who care about me?" The silence that followed his question was heavy with implication. Finally, Andromeda spoke. "Harry, writing to prisoners in Azkaban requires special permission from the Ministry, and given Sirius's conviction for crimes against your family specifically, they would never approve correspondence between you and him." "But what if he's innocent?" "Then he's been suffering in Azkaban for 10 years for crimes he didn't commit," Nymphadora said quietly, "which would be a tragedy beyond measure. But we can't prove his innocence from here, and even if we could, the legal process for overturning a conviction like his would take years." Harry stared down at the moonflower seeds in his palm, trying to imagine what it would be like to be trapped in a place where happiness was literally impossible, surrounded by creatures that fed on despair. If Sirius was innocent, he'd been enduring that torment while Harry grew up in a cupboard, both of them suffering because of the same betrayal that had killed James and Lily Potter. "I want to believe he's innocent," Harry said finally. "I want to believe that my parents chose someone worthy to be my godfather, and that somewhere out there is a person who loved them and would have loved me too." Andromeda reached over and covered his hand with hers, her touch warm and reassuring. "Whether Sirius is innocent or guilty, your parents' love for you was real. Their choice to name him as your godfather was made with the best of intentions, based on the person they believed him to be. And you're not responsible for his actions, Harry. You're not diminished or tainted by whatever he might have done. Besides," Nymphadora added, "you have family now. People who choose to love you every day, not just people who were appointed to care for you by legal document. That's not less valuable than what you might have had. In some ways, it's more valuable." They finished planting the moonflower seeds as the afternoon stretched toward evening, the conversation moving on to lighter topics, like what subjects Harry was most looking forward to studying at Hogwarts. But the knowledge of Sirius Black's existence and imprisonment remained in the back of Harry's mind, like a shadow, a reminder of the complicated legacy he'd inherited, along with his fame. As they prepared for dinner, Harry found himself thinking about the empty house in London, sitting dark and unused while its owner wasted away in a magical prison. He thought about the adventures he might have had, the stories he might have heard, the sense of connection to his parents that might have shaped his understanding of who he was meant to become. But he also thought about the garden they'd just planted together, about Andromeda's patient explanations, and Nymphadora's easy affection and Ted's quiet support. He thought about the family that had chosen to fight for him, to rescue him from a situation that no child should have had to endure. The loss of what might have been would always ache. But the gratitude for what he actually had, for the people who had seen him as worth saving and had acted on that belief, was stronger than the sorrow. And perhaps, Harry thought, as he helped set the table for Sunday dinner, that was enough to build a life on. Love freely given was rarer and more precious than love inherited through circumstance, and he had discovered that he was capable of inspiring both kinds. Whatever had happened to Sirius Black, whatever truth lay hidden behind his conviction and imprisonment, it belonged to the past. Harry's future lay with the family who had claimed him, who had made space for him at their table and in their hearts, who saw him as more than the sum of his tragic history. It was, he reflected, as they sat down to eat together, more than he'd ever dared to hope for. And it was enough. Harry woke on July 31st to the smell of bacon cooking and the sound of voices drifting up from the kitchen below. For a moment, he lay still in his real bed, in his real room, listening to what could only be described as the sounds of a family preparing for something special. It took him several seconds to remember what day it was, and when he did, the knowledge hit him with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. His birthday. His 11th birthday, which meant he was finally old enough for Hogwarts, old enough to begin learning real magic, old enough to start becoming the person he was meant to be, instead of the unwanted burden he'd been trained to think of himself as. But more than that, this would be his first birthday celebration. The Dursleys had always made it clear that Harry's birthday was an inconvenience that fell uncomfortably close to Dudley's, and that any acknowledgement of it was a generous favour that he should accept with gratitude and silence. He'd never had a party, never had presents chosen specifically for him, never had anyone sing "Happy Birthday" and mean it. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Harry?" Andromeda's voice was warm with affection. "Are you awake, birthday boy?" Birthday boy. The casual endearment made something flutter in Harry's chest. "I'm awake," he called back. "Excellent. Come down when you're ready. We have some surprises for you." Surprises. Harry dressed quickly, his hands shaking slightly with anticipation. In the month since the custody hearing had made everything official, he'd grown more comfortable with the idea that good things might actually happen to him. But the concept of birthday surprises still felt too wonderful to quite believe. The kitchen had been transformed. Colourful streamers hung from the ceiling, and a banner reading, "Happy 11th Birthday, Harry," stretched across the far wall. The table was set with the good dishes, and in the centre sat a chocolate cake with 11 candles already lit and waiting. Ted looked up from where he was arranging what appeared to be a small mountain of wrapped presents. "There's our birthday boy. How does it feel to be 11? "Different," Harry said honestly. "Like something important is supposed to happen now." "Something important is going to happen," Nymphadora said, bouncing slightly in her chair. Her hair was a festive gold that matched the candle flames, and she was grinning with barely contained excitement. "You're going to Hogwarts! You're going to learn proper magic! You're going to fly on a broomstick and make potions and probably set something on fire by accident in charms class." "Tonks," Andromeda said mildly. "Try not to worry him before he's even had breakfast." "I'm not worried," Harry said quickly. "I'm excited. I've never been excited about school before." And it was true. The prospect of attending Hogwarts, of learning to control and direct the magic that had been nothing but a source of trouble for his entire life, felt like the most wonderful gift imaginable. Better than presents, better than cake, better than birthday surprises. though he was definitely excited about those too. Speaking of which, Ted said, settling into his chair with a cup of coffee, we should probably talk about what to expect when your Hogwarts letter arrives. It'll come by owl, probably sometime in the next few weeks, and it'll include your supply list and instructions for getting to Diagon Alley. Diagon Alley? Magical shopping district in London, Nymphadora explained. That's where you'll get your school books, your cauldron, your robes, and... Her eyes lit up with delight. Your wand. Oh, Harry, getting your wand is the most brilliant thing. Mr. Ollivander will try dozens of different wands on you until he finds the one that chooses you specifically. The wand chooses the wizard, Andromeda said. It's one of the fundamental principles of wand law. Your wand will be perfectly suited to your magical style and temperament. Harry tried to imagine walking into a shop and having a piece of wood choose him, having something respond to his magic instead of causing problems and punishment. Will you come with me when I go to get my wand? Of course, Ted said immediately. We'll make a proper day of it. Diagon Alley, lunch somewhere nice, maybe a visit to Florian Fortescue's for ice cream. Can we do the birthday cake first? Harry asked, staring at the 11 candles with something approaching reverence. I've never blown out birthday candles before. The silence that followed his admission was brief but heavy with shared recognition of how many ordinary childhood experiences Harry had been denied. But instead of dwelling on what he'd missed, Andromeda simply smiled and said, "Then we'd better make this one extra special." They sang "Happy Birthday" with enthusiasm, if not perfect harmony, and Harry made a wish before blowing out all 11 candles in one breath. The wish was simple, that this happiness would last, that these people would continue to want him around, that he would never have to go back to being unwanted and invisible. The presents came next, and each one felt like a small miracle. Books about magical creatures and Quidditch techniques and the history of Hogwarts, a set of high-quality quills and inkwells, a warm cloak in deep green that Andromeda said would be perfect for winter evenings at school, and from Nymphadora, a magical photograph album that would let him keep moving pictures of important moments. For when you're away at school, she explained, so you don't forget what home looks like. Home. The word still sent a warm glow through Harry's chest whenever someone applied it to this house, this family, this life that felt too good to be entirely real. There's one more thing, Ted said, glancing at Andromeda with a slight smile. Something we've been discussing as a family. He handed Harry an official-looking document that bore the ministry seal. Harry unfolded it carefully, trying to make sense of the formal language. It's adoption papers, Andromeda explained gently. Legal documentation that would make you our son in every way that matters. Not just guardianship, but actual adoption, with our family name if you want it. Harry stared at the papers, his vision blurring slightly as the magnitude of what they were offering hit him. You want to adopt me? Really adopt me? Only if you want us to, Ted said quickly. There's no pressure, Harry. You're already part of our family, no matter what the papers say. But if you'd like to make it official... I would, Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'd like that very much. The hug that followed was warm and fierce, and lasted long enough for Harry to truly believe it was real. When they finally separated, Nymphadora was wiping her eyes, and Ted was clearing his throat in the way adults did when they were trying not to show how emotional they were feeling. Right then, Andromeda said briskly, though her own voice was slightly unsteady. I believe someone mentioned something about aura training. Nymphadora straightened, her hair shifting to a professional dark brown. Oh, yes. Harry, you should know that I start my official aura training next week. 3 years of the most intensive magical education the ministry offers. What do auras do? Harry asked. Dark wizard catchers, she said proudly. We track down dangerous criminals, investigate magical crimes, protect important people and places. It's dangerous work, but it's also some of the most important work in the wizarding world. Ted leaned back in his chair, pride evident in his expression. It's what Tonks has wanted to do since she was 12 years old. Some children dream of playing Quidditch professionally or becoming famous potion makers. Our daughter wanted to fight dark wizards. The world's safer with people like Tonks protecting it, Andromeda added, though I do worry about the dangers she'll face. Nymphadora reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. I'll be careful, Mum. Besides, I've got natural advantages that most auras don't have. She demonstrated by shifting her face slightly, changing her nose shape and eye color. Hard for dark wizards to recognize you, if you can look like anyone. The conversation turned to Harry's own future, to the possibilities that would open up once he started learning magic properly. He could become anything he wanted. A healer, a curse breaker, a Quidditch player, a teacher, an aura like Nymphadora. For the first time in his life, the future stretched ahead of him, full of choices rather than predetermined limitations. There's something else we should discuss, Andromeda said, as they finished the cake. Something about your fame, and what that might mean when you arrive at Hogwarts. Harry's stomach clenched slightly. His fame was still the most uncomfortable part of his new identity, the aspect of being Harry Potter that felt most foreign and unwanted. People are going to expect things from you, Ted said gently. Some will expect you to be a hero. Others will expect you to be arrogant or spoiled. Some might even resent you for the attention you've received. None of these expectations are fair, but they're something you'll need to navigate. The most important thing to remember, Andromeda said, is that you don't owe anyone anything. You were a baby when you survived that curse. You don't have to live up to anyone else's idea of what Harry Potter should be. But what if I can't? Harry asked. What if I'm not brave enough or powerful enough or special enough? Nymphadora snorted. Harry, you survived 10 years with the Dursleys and came out of it kind and grateful and eager to learn about magic. If that's not brave enough, I don't know what is. And as for powerful, Ted added, you talked to a snake and made its glass cage disappear without even meaning to. Most adult wizards couldn't manage wandless magic like that. The point is, Andromeda concluded, you're already enough exactly as you are. Everything else, the fame, the expectations, the responsibilities that people want to put on your shoulders, those are things other people have created. Your job is to be Harry, to learn what makes you happy, and to become the person you want to be. As the afternoon stretched into evening, they talked about Hogwarts houses and school subjects and the magical career paths that might interest him. They discussed the ongoing blood protection arrangements. Harry had successfully completed 2 monthly visits to Privet Drive with minimal stress, and the security measures that would be in place during his school years. But mostly, they simply enjoyed being a family. Harry helped Ted with the washing up, while Nymphadora demonstrated advanced transfiguration techniques she'd learned in her final year at school. Andromeda worked on correspondence related to Harry's official adoption, while keeping up a running commentary about the various ministry officials whose signatures were required. As they prepared for bed, Harry found himself thinking about the difference between this birthday and every birthday that had come before. Not just the presents and the cake and the celebration, though those had been wonderful, but the feeling of being seen and known and wanted, of having people invest time and energy in his happiness, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Harry, Andromeda said, stopping by his room as he got ready for bed. I want you to know how proud we are of you. How proud we are to be your family." "I haven't done anything yet," Harry protested. "I haven't accomplished anything, or proven myself, or—" "You've been brave enough to trust us," she said simply. "You've been open enough to let us love you. You've been generous enough to love us back. Those aren't small things, Harry. Those are some of the most important things a person can do." After she left, Harry lay in his bed in his room, in his home, and thought about the year that stretched ahead of him. Hogwarts and magic lessons and making friends and learning who he was when he wasn't defined by other people's resentment or indifference. For the first time in his life, the future felt like a gift rather than a threat. And that, he thought as he drifted off to sleep, was the best birthday present anyone could have asked for. 3 weeks after Harry's birthday, the Hogwarts letter arrived on a Tuesday morning while they were having breakfast. The tawny owl that delivered it perched patiently on the kitchen windowsill, while Harry opened the heavy parchment envelope with hands that trembled slightly with excitement. "Mr. H. Potter," he read aloud. "The Tonks residence. Kitchen table. Little Whinging. Surrey." He looked up with delight. "It knows exactly where I am. It knows I live here now." "Magic has a way of keeping track of these things," Ted said, smiling at Harry's wonder. "Though I suspect the change of address notification we filed with the Ministry might have helped as well." Harry continued reading the letter, his eyes growing wider with each line. The formal acceptance to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the list of required books and equipment, the instructions for reaching platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station. It was all real, all official, all addressed to him as a member of the Tonks family. "September 1st, he said, looking up from the letter. "Term starts September 1st. "Which gives us just over a month to get everything sorted," Andromeda said, consulting her own calendar. "Diagon Alley for supplies, meetings with the school to discuss your security arrangements, and we'll need to make sure the blood protection monitoring is working properly while you're away at school." The blood protection had indeed proven stable with the new arrangement. Harry's monthly visits to Privet Drive were brief and supervised, lasting just long enough to satisfy the magical requirements without subjecting him to any meaningful contact with the Dursleys. Petunia remained coldly polite during these visits, while Vernon mostly avoided being in the same room. Dudley had grown curious about Harry's transformation from cowering relative to confident child with magical guardians, but their interactions were limited to awkward small talk. "The monitoring charms are working perfectly," Nymphadora said, looking up from her own correspondence. Her hair was currently a business-like brown. She'd discovered that her Auror instructors took her more seriously when she looked conventionally professional. The ward specialists confirmed that the protection is as strong as it's ever been, maybe stronger now that Harry isn't under constant emotional stress. It was true. The magical protections that Lily Potter's sacrifice had established seemed to respond positively to Harry's improved emotional state. The monthly visits to Privet Drive were uncomfortable but not traumatic, and the knowledge that he belonged somewhere else, that people were waiting for him to return home, made even those brief encounters bearable. "What about security at Hogwarts?" Harry asked. "Will I need special protection there?" Ted exchanged a look with Andromeda. They'd spent considerable time discussing this very question with ministry officials and school administrators. "Hogwarts itself is one of the most heavily protected places in magical Britain," Ted said finally. "The castle has defensive enchantments that have been building for over 1,000 years. But yes, there will be some additional precautions given your unique circumstances." "Nothing too obvious," Andromeda added quickly. "We don't want your school experience to be defined by security concerns, but there will be people keeping an eye on things, making sure you're safe to simply be a student." The idea of being safe to simply be a student was still novel enough to make Harry's chest tight with gratitude. For 10 years, his existence had been defined by the need to be invisible, to cause no trouble, to make no demands on the adults responsible for his care. The concept that people would actively work to ensure his safety and happiness, that his well-being was considered important enough to warrant official attention, remained almost too wonderful to fully believe. "I start my advanced aura training the same week you leave for school," Nymphadora said, clearly trying to lighten the mood. "So we'll both be off having adventures in magical education, though mine will involve significantly more hexing practice and significantly less potions homework." "You'll write to us, won't you?" Andromeda asked Harry. "Every week, at minimum. I want to know how your classes are going, who you're making friends with, whether you're eating properly." The maternal concern in her voice was something Harry was still adjusting to. Having someone worry about whether he was eating properly, having someone want regular updates on his daily life, not to monitor his behavior, but because they genuinely cared about his happiness, it was a gift he'd never expected to receive. "I'll write every week," he promised. "Maybe more, if interesting things happen." "Oh, interesting things will definitely happen," Ted said with a grin. "You're Harry Potter attending Hogwarts. I'd be surprised if you made it through your first month without at least one adventure that makes the Prophet's front page." "Speaking of which," Andromeda said, "we should probably discuss how to handle your fame once you're at school. There will be students who want to befriend you because of your celebrity status, and others who might resent the attention you receive. Learning to navigate those relationships will be part of your education too." Harry nodded seriously. They'd touched on this subject before, but the closer he got to actually attending Hogwarts, the more real the challenges became. He'd spent 10 years being nobody special, and now he had to figure out how to be somebody very special indeed, without letting it go to his head or define his entire identity. "The most important thing," Nymphadora said, "is to remember that your real friends will be the ones who like you for who you are, not for what you represent. Look for the people who treat you like Harry, not like the boy who lived. And don't be afraid to set boundaries," Andromeda added. "You don't owe anyone your story, your time, or your friendship just because they're curious about your fame. It's perfectly acceptable to say no to requests you're not comfortable with." As the summer continued, they settled into the rhythm of preparing for Harry's departure, while savoring the remaining time they had as a complete family unit. Shopping trips to Diagon Alley, where Harry experienced the wonder of magical commerce and the strange sensation of being recognized by strangers who whispered his name with something approaching reverence. Quiet evenings at home, where they read together and talked about magic and planned for the future that was opening up before all of them. Harry's adoption papers were finalized in mid-August, making him officially Harry Potter Tonks. He'd chosen to keep his original surname while adding his new family name, creating a legal identity that honored both his birth parents and his chosen family. The ceremony had been small and private, just the 4 of them, and a ministry official in a quiet office overlooking Diagon Alley. But the emotional weight of it had been enormous, the formal acknowledgement that he belonged somewhere, that people had chosen him and committed to loving him unconditionally. The night before Harry was scheduled to leave for Hogwarts, they had a special dinner featuring all of his favorite foods. Ted had taken the day off work, and Nymphadora had arranged to delay her own departure for aura training by 24 hours so she could see Harry off at King's Cross Station. "I have something for you," Andromeda said as they finished dessert. She handed him a small wrapped package that felt heavier than its size suggested. Inside was a magical mirror, similar to the ones used for communication, but clearly designed for a different purpose. When Harry looked into it, his reflection was surrounded by a faint, warm glow. "It's connected to mirrors here at home," Andromeda explained. "If you ever need us, not just for emergencies, but if you're homesick or worried, or just want to see familiar faces, you can call us through the mirror, any time of day or night." "We'll always answer," Ted added, "no matter what time it is or what we're doing. You're our son now, Harry. That means you never have to face anything alone again." The words hit Harry with the same force they'd had months ago, when Andromeda had first suggested that he might want to be part of their family. But now they carried the weight of lived experience, of months spent discovering what it meant to be genuinely wanted and cared for. "Thank you," he said, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion. "For everything. For rescuing me. For fighting for me. For making me part of your family." "Thank you," Nymphadora said softly, "for letting us rescue you. For trusting us enough to love us back." That night, Harry lay in his bed for what would be the last time for several months, thinking about the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. 6 months ago, he'd been a boy living in a cupboard, convinced that he was fundamentally unlovable, and that his strange abilities made him a freak who deserved punishment. Tonight, he was the legally adopted son of people who celebrated his magic, supported his dreams, and worried about his happiness. The transformation hadn't been magic in the literal sense. No spells had been cast to change his fundamental nature or circumstances. But it had been magical in every way that mattered. The magic of people choosing to care, of adults putting a child's welfare ahead of their own convenience, of a family opening their hearts and home to someone who needed belonging more than anything else in the world. Tomorrow, he would board the Hogwarts Express and begin the next chapter of his education. He would learn to brew potions and cast spells and fly on a broomstick. He would make friends and face challenges and discover what kind of wizard he wanted to become. He would navigate the complexities of fame and friendship and growing up in a world that had expectations about who Harry Potter was supposed to be. But underneath all of that, providing a foundation of strength and security that could weather any storm, he would carry the knowledge that he was loved. Not because of his fame, or his survival, or his magical abilities, but simply because he was Harry. Because 3 people had looked at a damaged, neglected child and seen someone worth fighting for, someone worth saving, someone worth loving unconditionally. As he drifted off to sleep, Harry thought about the boa constrictor that had started this entire transformation. The snake had thanked him for setting it free, for giving it the chance to go somewhere it belonged. At the time, Harry had been amazed by the creature's gratitude for such a simple act of kindness. Now he understood exactly how the snake had felt. The magic that had made the glass disappear had been nothing compared to the magic that had brought him home. And unlike the dramatic spell that had saved his life as a baby, this magic wasn't something that had happened to him without his knowledge or consent. This was magic he had helped to create. Magic that required his participation and trust and willingness to believe that good things were possible. It was, Harry thought drowsily, the most powerful magic he'd ever experienced. And it was just the beginning of what was possible when people chose to see the best in each other and act with love instead of fear. Outside his window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new adventures and challenges and opportunities. But tonight, Harry Potter Tonks fell asleep in his own bed, in his own room, in a house where he was wanted and loved and celebrated for exactly who he was.